I agree with all of this. I think I can offer a couple of remarks that might be useful. First of all, the scale of the loss is absolutely devastating, right? I mean, what we have in terms of classical Greek literature is less than 2% of the total out. And if you count everything written down, of course, it's way below 1% because of the documentary sources. But
I didn't know as low as 2%. I thought it was like we lost more than half or something. But you're saying we lost 98%?
It looks actually worse now than it maybe looked a couple of decades ago based on new research, right? I mean, I'm going mostly by Reviel Netz's data. The plague of Justinian was apparently a really bad plague. 10 years or a little bit more, we've known that this is indeed another installment of the Black Death that hit Europe and large parts of the rest of the world in the 14th century, right? It's the same bacterium that presumably caused a very similar set of symptoms, volcanic eruptions that caused at least a regional cooling, a drop in temperatures. There were two such eruptions in roughly the 530s to, I think, 536, 540. Got anathemized after his death because he had the wrong ideas about the Trinity, right? That sort of thing happens a lot in the history of Christianity. Mm-hmm. You have the wrong idea about the Trinity or something like that, and eventually some council says, okay, this guy is no longer canonical. Or even his works need to be burned or something like that. These things happen with theology. I mean, population decline is pretty widely detected by archaeologists, and Hypatia is a female philosopher who was famous in her own day, and because of the fact that she was killed by a mob of Christians, apparently affiliated with the Bishop of Alexandria, she's become the stuff of many legends, right? Because there are modern movements like feminism and various forms of secularism who appreciate her function as a figurehead of some sort.
Today's guest is returning Dr. Philipp Nothaft, University of Oxford, 50-pound fellow, All Souls College, scholar of chronology, calendars, systems of dating, medieval science, astronomy, European intellectual history, ancient to modern, Jews and Christians in medieval Europe. Today we are discussing the Dark Ages. What does this term mean? Where does it come from? Is it legit? Should we use it? And why is this term Dark Ages so hard to remove from the stain of history? All that and more. Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Joining me again is Dr. Philipp Nothaft, who was on last Christmas around that time period, and we had a nice discussion, nice balanced and nuanced discussion regarding the origins of December 25th. And today, I would like to have a similar balanced, nuanced discussion on the quote-unquote Dark Ages. And a lot of times when it comes to this topic, what you find often is not in scholarly circles, but in like on popular, blogs or whatever, you get either they're picking a side, either they hate the early Middle Ages and they're going to talk about how that's the worst period ever and human civilization was basically on the brink of destruction and, everything was just hell. Or you get, no, this is a completely misunderstood time. Actually, things were amazing, better than ever, actually, better than before, better than the pagans. The Christians actually saved us. And so I don't think either of those are correct, in my opinion. And I wanted to have a discussion on sort of this topic. I have a few quotes from some books that I want to throw at you and then just get your thoughts on this topic in general. The first one is from a book by Dan Jones. Dan Jones, in his Powers and Thrones, says the Roman Empire had once been a super spreader of classical learning across its vast territories. But as it fell to pieces in the West, it became ever more doctrinally obsessed in the East. It became an active blocker to knowledge chains across the ages, and the transmission of ancient learning throughout the empire began to fail. One reason that the label, the Dark Ages, has proven so hard to untie from the neck of the Middle Ages is that for hundreds of years, between the 6th century and the first beginnings of the Renaissance, and just real quick note on that, I've noticed a lot of people like to make the Dark Ages from 500 to 1500, which is crazy. Either they're doing that as a straw man or they're doing it because they really don't know history. They're trying to attack that whole period. Anyways, in the late 13th, the scientific and rational insights of the ancient world were forgotten or suppressed in the West. This was not simply an unfortunate symptom of creeping cultural dementia. It sprang from a deliberate policies of Eastern emperors like Justinian, who made it their business to hound out their world, the self-appointed but unfortunately unchristian guardians of priceless knowledge. And then I just want to real quick switch over to Gregory of Tours, an actual primary source, not from a modern book writer. And Gregory of Tours writes, however, no writer has come to the fore who has been sufficiently skilled in setting things down in any orderly fashion to be able to describe these events in prose or in verse. In fact, the towns of Gaul, the writing of literature has declined to the point where it has virtually disappeared altogether. Many people have complained about this, not once, but time and time again. What a poor period this is, they have been heard to say. If among all our people there is not one man to be found who can write a book about what is happening today, the pursuit of letters really in us is dead. And then it brings us to the early Renaissance, people like Petrarch, Machiavelli, and Dante, and Bruni, and Flavio Bruni, and all those great Renaissance writers, these humanists that are kind of looking at this period that they just kind of came out of. And I think that's where this Dark Ages idea comes from. And I think the scholarly, and this is my last thing, I think the scholarly approach is that the term Dark Ages doesn't really fit as a historiography. You have the Iron Age, you have the Bronze Age, you have the Classical period, the Hellenistic period, and Antiquity, and then you have Middle Ages, Medieval, and then so forth. The Dark Ages isn't necessarily a period that we can use for historiography, but it's more of just like a description of a certain time period. So I threw a lot at you there, but go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that is a lot to unpack. I mean, the first quote was from Dan Jones. Is that his name again? I'm not familiar with the book. I mean, this is obviously written by somebody who hasn't really, kept up with the literature on this topic. This sounds like a kind of, echo of Gibbon, maybe. And so some of those statements are weird, right? I don't see the Roman Empire as a super spreader of classical literature across all of its territorial possessions. I don't think we have a lot of evidence for the spread of classical literature to Dacia or to, the Basque country or parts of the Rhineland. This is a bit strange. I think one misconception that sometimes arises is when people look at the Roman Empire as a culturally very unified, sort of homogeneous entity, rather than looking at the Greek and the Latin-speaking world as two different theaters of literature and different disciplines and so on, right? I mean, one big problem for the West that becomes very obvious as the Western Roman Empire kind of winds down is that fewer and fewer people know any Greek. And so the Greek literature that we associate with classical antiquity becomes inaccessible. It's not available in many places in the first place. It's really only towards the end of what we call antiquity in the late 5th, early 6th century that we see visible efforts to preserve Greek literature by rendering it into Latin. And so many of the Greek texts that were available in the Latin world during the early Middle Ages were translated in this relatively late period and into the 7th century, partly thanks to ongoing contact zones with the Byzantine world. Medical literature would be an example. Some works by Aristotle that Boethius, for instance, translated. But it's a misleading idea that, Rome as the center of political power is just disseminating Greek wisdom all the way to southern England and Brittany and northern France and so on. That's not really what's happening. And one reason you have this absence of Greek philosophy, certain elements of Greek mathematics and science in the early medieval Latin West, which is, of course, most frequently associated with the term Dark Ages, is because this literature simply wasn't available to begin with. And the other strange thing about the way Dan Jones frames this is to blame Justinian, who of course, had long lost control over many of these areas to begin with. So his baneful influence would have been felt in the East. But of course, it's in the East where a lot of Greek epic poetry and drama and philosophy survives, and I don't think there's much evidence that Justinian's reign had a lot to do with its disappearance to begin with. It's a very complicated story. Of course, you can find signs of decline in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries very easily, right? If that's your goal, to find signs of economic, demographic, cultural decline, No problem. That won't be the issue. But this idea that there are sort of nefarious political forces, for instance, at play that try to suppress ancient literature, we don't really have good evidence of that. And overall, there's a strong sense, in strong degree to which the Byzantines, right, whenever, there's this strange question, when does the Roman Empire become Byzantine? It's a very arbitrary kind of terminology. And at the moment, historians are, I think, pushing towards abandoning the term Byzantine altogether. But to many people, Justinian is the first Byzantine emperor or something along those lines. The point is that the Byzantines had literary tastes that are very continuous with the literary tastes of, the educated Greek elites of previous centuries. And there's a strong sense of continuity when it comes to the kinds of texts that are taught in schools as examples of good style, right? Sort of the classical Atticizing style that characterizes lots of drama and comedy and certain philosophical works. And of course, Homer was always the number one author and the number one model for what is great literature. And the Iliad is the one story everybody needs to know and read in school and so on. That never changes throughout the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, as far as we can tell.
What I'm gathering from this is, like, in the East, there's a whole different, they speak Greek. And so they're going to be more connected to their ancestors from the side of from the Greek world. Like, they're going to preserve Greek texts. In the West, it's Latin. So you're going to find Ovid. You're going to find, whatever Latin text they have. One of the things that when I look at this, one of the things that I don't think gets enough airtime is the like literature. So is it safe to say there is sort of a decline in classical literature after like the 6th century?
Yeah, I mean, Gregory of Tours, who's of course the other author who came up, he no longer writes classical Latin in sort of the fullest sense of the word. We have to be a bit careful because the edition that exists of his text, which was produced in 1930s, 40s, was done by somebody who worked on the assumption that he couldn't write proper Latin. And so when he had the chance to, to collate different manuscripts and use one particular version of a sentence, often the version of the sentence that ends up in the main text is the one that is more grammatically funky compared to maybe another manuscript. Maybe his Latin wasn't as bad as the edition makes it look. But the point is that, he writes at a time when Latin had evolved since classical times. And this was before the time where Latin and the Romance languages have fully diverged. And so, of course, his Latin differs from that of 300-400 years earlier. And yes, he sort of admits to the fact that his Latin isn't great. And he is certainly very critical of the literary culture surrounding him in Gaul in the middle of the 6th century or whatever exactly it is. But there's always a degree to which these kinds of statements are what we call a captatio benevolentiae, right? You start out very humbly and ask the reader not to be too critical, given your very limited abilities. That's something we find in lots of literature. There is certainly less literary activity that we can trace in the 6th and 7th and early 8th century in Gaul or in this Merovingian Frankish Empire, as it's also known. It never fully disappears. I mean, it's a period that is certainly marked by, the fact that this kind of command economy that the Roman Empire brought to the table has to a large extent disappeared or has been transformed. Long distance trade and other sort of sources of wealth generation have kind of to some extent fallen away, and the kind of public school system and certain mechanisms of patronage that were responsible for literary production in earlier centuries were less efficient. Of course, ecclesiastical institutions to some extent pick up the slack a little bit. So there's literary production, but not of the same kind that we're used from classical antiquity. We have instead lots of hagiography, right? That's probably the number one product of the Merovingian period. Lots of hagiographical texts. Some of them only survive in later copies, but it's pretty obvious that they are already from the 6th and 7th centuries. So people write things, they write different things. They still write poetry. They still write some history, but maybe not as much as in previous centuries. Overall, the impression of decline is not unwarranted, but the problem is in the 19th century, some historians have over-dramatized this, partially because they had not access to as many sources as we have now. And we also have to bear in mind that this is a period for which the sort of visible rate of book production is pretty low. It's not always clear whether this really means that so much fewer books were produced. This could also be partially the result of poor transmission, because there's this very important uptick in visible book production in the late 8th and during the 9th century. This is also the period when so many classical texts are copied, where the earliest copy that we have stems from this period. And it could, to an extent, be the case that Latin texts from the 6th to 8th centuries were not as valued as valued, and it might not have made it through certain bottlenecks, and the same might be true simply of books from that period. These are just general caveats, but I mean, when it comes to sort of classical forms of Latin literary production, I would certainly say that from the middle of the 6th to the middle of the 8th century, you have something approaching a nadir, and that's where the term Dark Ages maybe has its strongest foundation. I would still personally, as an historian, I don't like that term for mostly methodological reasons, but that impression is not completely absurd, and it's certainly the case that from those 2 centuries we have the fewest preserved books, or the lowest number overall. Of course, we also have very few books from antiquity, but it's noticeable that book production seems to be going down in the 7th century, even if you do all the statistical number crunching and trying to sort of guess how many books were actually produced from what we have. It still seems that the 7th century is a bit of a nadir in general. And of course, that might have reasons that are related to the kind of upheavals of the previous century with wars and plagues and global cooling and stuff like that.
Yeah, well said. That's exactly where I'm at on this, is that you do have these periods, like even the 3rd century, the crisis of the 3rd century. Why is that not being sort of taken into account of like the beginning of the decline before Christianity? And the 3rd century was a pretty rough time. The Roman Empire collapsed in the 3rd century. I mean, it kind of did. You had the the Galatian, what is it? The Western Galatian Empire. What is it called? Where the Roman Empire divides up into the Palmyrene dynasty over on the
right.
east. Yeah. And then they're it's like the Gallic, yes, the Gallic West. They sort of lose it for like a few decades, and then Aurelian sort of like takes everything back over again. That's a decline period right there. That's not a good period. So I would almost say like you can slide it back instead of doing this thing where we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and going 500 AD to 1000 AD. Perfect, clear 500-year period. It's like, wait a minute, what about the 3rd century? And what about Charlemagne's rise? That's kind of a golden age in the Franks. It's a golden age. So I think if we're going to use that term, not as historiography, but as a descriptor, I think you could slide it back to like 3rd to 7th century. And that's it. And I think after, and by the way, and it's not even just blaming Christians either. Yes, I think there's some dogmatic new trends of dogmatism being introduced that you don't really see, unless, like you see that on a local scale. So the Eleusinian mystery people are probably dogmatic about their Eleusinian mysteries. The Samothracian mystery people are probably dogmatic about theirs. You're going to have dogmatists in the ancient world, but it's not like a global corporation type of thing that you see with the church. So I guess that's partly true, but then you have to look at things like the plague. Is that Christians' fault that a plague hit during Justinian's reign? No, but the fact that it did hit and it was a really bad plague that affected the world for centuries, then you kind of have to factor that in. Is this a dark period? Then yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you brought up some really good points. So yes, the plague of Justinian was apparently a really bad plague. For the past 10 years or a little bit more, we've known that this is indeed another installment of the Black Death that hit Europe and large parts of the rest of the world in the 14th century. Right? It's the same bacterium that presumably caused a very similar set of symptoms. It's possible that this was even partially caused by volcanic eruptions that caused at least a regional cooling, a drop in temperatures. There were 2 such eruptions in roughly the 530s to, I think, 536, 540, which we can detect in tree ring chronologies and in ice core samples. So something really bad happened as far as, volcanic sort of aerosols and ash being blasted in the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, causing cooling. And there's a very recent argument developing that the reason the plague started around that time is because the conditions under which fleas start to jump from host to host, and when they bite them, vomit sort of blood mixed with Yersinia pestis back into the host. That kind of conditions depend on a certain maximum temperature. And since the plague probably started in southern Egypt or somewhere in that region, it started in a region that's normally very hot. But if the temperatures drop by a couple of degrees, that could have actually provided the right conditions for this pandemic to spread, right? This has something to do with the biofilm that essentially forces the flea to regurgitate whatever it sucks out of its host, and it regurgitates the bacterium back into the host, and it starts to essentially starve to death, and so it has to jump from host to host and search for nourishment. And yeah, it's an ugly story, but that's very plausibly what happened. Now that we have a good idea that this is essentially another version of the Black Death, which of course is infamous in history, it's becoming more plausible that this really threw the entire Mediterranean world for a loop.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, the Justinian plague caused like the decline of birth rates, and the population cut dramatically, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you know those numbers off the top of your head right now. Is that safe to say?
Yes, I mean, population decline is pretty widely detected by archaeologists, and in this period, there's another factor which hits Italy particularly hard, right? And that's the Gothic Wars, the attempt on Justinian's part to reconquer what was at that point the Austro-Gothic Empire, which covered Italy and surrounding areas. And that attempt was ultimately unsuccessful, but apparently really devastated the Italian landscape and several cities. And then, of course, shortly after that, when Italy was significantly weakened, the Lombards invade and take over large parts of Italy. And so for Italy, the 6th century, especially this mid to late 6th century, is a pretty strong watershed. And, again, one of the problems with this kind of Dark Age rhetoric is that it works for some regions so much better than others, right? It's really hard to argue that Denmark suffered a dark age in that period compared to what happened before. But for Italy, things look very drastic for a while. And a lot of this has to do with these devastating wars of the 6th century.
And so the Goths, they come in and they're already Christians before they didn't bring paganism, Germanic paganism, to the West. They come in and they conquer the Western Empire, and they sort of just kind of continue business as usual. It's not really this fall of the Roman Empire like people make it out to be. There wasn't like this giant barbarian invasion where they're killing people. It was more of Rome was already just kind of declined at that point, and the Goths were like, we're just going to go in and just take over. We're just going to continue. What can you explain that to people? That the idea that the 476 wasn't really this fall that everyone makes it out to be.
Yes, I mean that's a very good point. So overall, what historians now, the way they think of this longer drawn-out period from 200 to 800, it includes, of course, the crisis of the 3rd century. This is something I didn't really address earlier. You're completely right. This is a big deal. Not everybody agrees that it was a really big deal, but overall it's clear that the Roman Empire never really recovers from what happened in the 3rd century. There's also plague in the 3rd century. There's also plague in the 2nd century. It's not bubonic plague. It's something else, but still.
The Antonine plague.
The Antonine plague, the plague of Cyprian, right? That was
Cyprian plague, yeah.
So those also have...
So things were getting bad before.
Absolutely getting bad. There's also evidence of climate sort of negative climate developments there, which of course has effects on crop yields and so on. And there's this big crisis in the 3rd century when the Roman Empire breaks apart and has to be reassembled through extremely bloody wars, right? And of course, the instability caused by essentially, emperors dying after a few months in office, and so on and so forth. This is all well known. For literary production, this has a pretty visible effects. There's overall just less Greek and Roman literature from the 3rd century than from the century before or after, right? 4th century is a major recovery in this area, especially for Latin, right? The late 4th, early 5th century Latin literature offers you the most words, as it were. If you study that period, you get more authors and more words than for previous periods. Okay, partially that's because of St. Augustine, but even if you subtract him, there's just a real smorgasbord of literature that survives.
You got Nonus. Nonus's Dionysica is gigantic. That's in Greek too.
Yeah.
So even Greek had a little bit of a comeback.
It had. Yeah, Greek had certainly had a comeback. I mean, overall, there's so much more Greek than Latin from antiquity up to 500, and Latin, makes up for some of that by having a good rate of production in the 4th and 5th centuries. But it's noticeable that certain things change. For instance, from the 2nd century, from this kind of high water mark of the Antonine period, we have evidence of a book trade, right? We have evidence that there are people who are making a living by employing scribes to produce books and sell them in shops. And a sort of a general audience can purchase books for relatively moderate sums, like a day's wage. And that's something that we can sort of discern through literary sources that it happens in the 2nd century. Afterwards, that kind of thing becomes a rarity. Of course, you still get occasional pieces of evidence that you can buy books on the open market, but book production seems to kind of shift back to being controlled by aristocrats, right, who employ scribes so they can get hold of certain texts. And books circulate within sort of scholastic settings, right? They circulate between teachers and their students and as part of schools. And patronage networks that were very obvious and common up to the 2nd century seem to be decreasing as well, right? The rate at which some people make a living by writing books and then getting some kind of obulus, some kind of remuneration from wealthy patrons, members of the aristocracy. All of that seems less prominent, even though it still exists to a certain extent at the end of antiquity in the 4th and 5th centuries. And what's also noticeable is that literary production in these more, let's say, knowledge-oriented areas like philosophy and mathematics becomes very conservative, right? There is less focus on innovation and more on preservation. We get lots of evidence of people creating new editions of older texts, writing commentaries on them so that future generations have an easier time understanding these texts. Commentaries may be written by masters for their students, and that becomes a very common mode of how literature is produced. There's more of an effort to preserve canons. And some of the sort of creative sap that we associate with, ancient Greek philosophy and science in scare quotes is no longer as visibly there. Of course, these are things that one can easily over dramatize, but still, right? If you think about a field such as mathematical astronomy, right, the last really sort of innovative author who made his mark is Ptolemy in the middle of the 2nd century, and that becomes sort of the new standard for how to practice mathematical astronomy. And there's not much new coming after. It's not that people stop doing astronomy, but there's a certain conservatism that's very noticeable, and that's something that maybe to some extent is a legacy of that very difficult 3rd century.
Yeah. And you look at Euclid and Archimedes and these scientific, and the book that you sent me as a book to read to prep for this was pretty interesting. I'm just off the top of my head remembering, they talk about the term mathematikos, meaning a wide variety of things in the ancient world. Almost like sometimes it could be kind of mystical, or it could be science or something. And so do you think, the question is, do you think there is some truth to the idea that scientific or proto-scientific, we should say, Aristotle's deductive reasoning type of mindset did actually decline in this period?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Greek mathematics, I'm here slightly dependent on the ideas of Reviel Netz. So there's a very impressive classicist at Stanford, and he's sort of the world's authority on the history of ancient Greek mathematics. And one of the points that he often makes in his publications is that Greek mathematics, when it comes to the real sort of burst of creativity and people out to prove new theorems and come up with completely new branches of mathematics, this is a product of like 2 big generations that sort of occur at the end of the classical period and then later in the Hellenistic period. And already by the end of the Hellenistic period, right, we no longer have this constant sort of churning out of new ideas in Greek mathematics. Of course, there are counterexamples from later centuries. And he sees that later period in the 4th and 5th centuries as a period of where there's a concerted effort made by individuals, like for instance Theon of Alexandria, who's the father of the famous Hypatia. These people take these old texts, create new editions, write commentaries on them, and make sure that future generations have them. And they think of them as a corpus of stuff worth preserving, rather than something that really needs new editions. This is in this later period also linked with generally the study of late Platonic philosophy. Mathematics and late Platonic philosophy to a certain extent go hand in hand, and this sort of conservative approach to these areas of knowledge is overall quite similar. What one shouldn't underestimate is the importance of this contribution to the preservation of this stuff. So Netz, for instance, argues that the survival rate for ancient Greek mathematics is way better than for other forms of literature. I'm trying to remember the numbers, but I think there are about 150 known mathematicians from antiquity, and we still have a sizable chunk of 20 of them, which is a much better rate for them for poetry or whatever else you might be thinking of. And this is partially due to these preservation efforts that are made at the end of antiquity.
That is one thing we got to give the Christians credit for in this period. They did preserve the proto-scientific mathematical treatises of the ancient world. They weren't throwing, like, there's this idea out there that they were like anti-science and burning books because they were against the Bible. Not necessarily. A lot of these church fathers were following Aristotle's type of mindset, where truth is from God. We should follow this truth. So they did have somewhat of a attitude of preserving knowledge that doesn't get a lot of airtime. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. As so often, there are different opinions, right, within one set of people or in one particular society, and you certainly get both ends of the spectrum when you look at patristic literature or earlier Christian literature. You get sort of the Tertullian approach. That's an author from roughly the beginning of the 3rd century, who famously, right, said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That's one of his quips, but that essentially expressed the idea that the pagan heritage, whether it's philosophical or otherwise, is to a large extent worthless because it comes from people who don't follow the path to truth. Overall, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your Basil of Caesarea or Augustine of Hippo, who are maybe not hugely enthusiastic about classical or pagan learning, but they understand there is something of value there. And of course, their own, they still live in a time when their own education that made them a literate person was heavily shaped by texts that are centuries old and that come out of pre-Christian times in many cases. And in overall, right, it doesn't really matter so much whether these people were Christians or what certain church fathers think. I think we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which this canon of school texts that were regarded as models of how to express yourself in Latin, of how to develop your rhetoric, of how to write good grammar and so on, was so heavily shaped by classical pre-Christian literature, and that canon was so heavily ingrained in the way, especially in the Greek East, Greeks thought about their own literary heritage, that it was just unlikely to disappear. I can only bang on about Homer's Iliad, right? We have 7,000 or so surviving Greek literary papyri, almost all of them from Egypt. Homer's Iliad accounts for like 20%, some insane number of them, in terms of surviving fragments of the Iliad, right? This is the key text, and it really doesn't matter what any church father thinks, whether this is good or bad or worth preserving. The general culture is just so marinated in this stuff. And the same is true of certain Athenian playwrights. The same is true of Plato, for instance, by far the most popular philosopher of antiquity. It's no accident that we still have practically all of his works, right? Because he is the kingpin of philosophy. For other philosophers, that bottleneck towards the end of antiquity was more difficult to get through. But there's a certain sort of canon of eternally popular Greek literature that was unlikely to disappear regardless of what the church thinks.
This has been so much part of my worldview, is that when we talk about the West or Western civilization, it often gets all the credit goes to Christianity. Is like the reason why the West is so great is because we're Christian. And it's like, okay, there's some truth to Christian identity in the West and being a part of who we are. Yeah, fine. But it's just as much part of us as the ancient classical world of Homer and Aristotle and Plato and Euripides and Archimedes. And that is, those are our ancestral thinkers, if you think about it. And a lot of these Christians do draw from them as much as they draw from Old Testament stuff. So I think people need to know, like, yeah, there's other factors. Like the cultural milieu is not just Christianity.
Yes, it is. I mean, generally speaking, the idea that there's this very hard and fast dichotomy between pagans and Christians in late antiquity needs to be interrogated a little bit, right? These are people that inherit a shared literary culture. And another example of that, maybe it's a bit out of left field, but something I study personally are things such as, forms of magic and superstition in the early medieval period that come in form of charms and textual amulets and things of that nature, or methods of predicting the future. And this is generally stuff that already existed in pre-Christian antiquity or has very clear pre-Christian roots. Sometimes it's superficially Christianized, sometimes it's not Christianized at all. And they just keep using this kind of stuff, right? But the religion is really secondary to the fact that this is kind of regarded as secret, maybe, or arcane knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless, and something that might be useful in certain contexts, right? There are sort of these undercurrents to the culture that are not interrupted by Christianization in the slightest.
Yeah, I mean, this brings us to the whole science and thing about this period, because when we get to the Renaissance and we look at Da Vinci, for example, Da Vinci is quoting from Vitruvius, the Vitruvius man with the guy with his arms out. There's a pagan author. He's also citing the works of Archimedes, and he's drawing from the classical period. And so I think the Renaissance does have a lot of what the Renaissance is doing is kind of returning back to pre-Christian times and sort of adding that to the culture again.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Vitruvius actually is a good example to think about the general phenomenon of Renaissances, right? The earliest surviving manuscript of Vitruvius that I'm aware of dates from around the year 800. And it's not quite clear where it was written, but is probably at its earliest stage at in a part of the library of Charlemagne, right, at his court in Aachen. And it's a product of the Carolingian Renaissance. It would have been copied from a much earlier book. The point here is that Vitruvius is an author who was available in the Middle Ages, but of course his reception skyrocketed in the 15th century. It's a bit of a similar case to Lucretius, right? Who also didn't disappear during the Middle Ages, but there was like this reappropriation of the author. The interesting point here is that the 9th century, or the late 8th century and 9th century, also represents a kind of Renaissance. Certainly the contemporaries of that time period thought they are going through some kind of rebirth, or at least a renewal of Roman literary culture. It's not entirely obvious why there was such a reinvigoration of the copying of classical texts. But it's a crucial period, right? Thousands of copies of classical texts were presumably made. We still have hundreds of them. And in many cases, it's the earliest surviving copy of a classical Latin text. There's a lot, this period contributed to the survival of this literary culture. And of course, Renaissance humanists wouldn't have been able to access this literature without these copying efforts. I mean, if you go through all the classical authors that were copied in the 9th century in Carolingian scriptoria, it's pretty much, it's very close to the full corpus, or at least a very large chunk of it. And if you read the names, right, you will recognize, of course, many of them. It's an astonishing sort of outpouring of copying these texts, not always for obvious reasons, but it happens. And of course, some of that has to do with an understanding that this is a heritage worth salvaging.
Okay, this brings me to the growth of science in this period, because you'll hear people say we'd be traveling to planets right now if the Christianity never happened, and we had just from Galen to Da Vinci in 1 century easily. And okay, I think that's obviously a nonsensical statement. There's no way of knowing that, and I don't even think, even based on the data, that you can make that argument. But when you look at Galen as this updated scientific medical document from the 2nd century AD, and when you read through Galen, he's citing from Asclepiades, from the 1st century BC. And then that's sort of updating Dioscorides and Hippocrates and these medical authors. You get like a line of medical authors in every century before that. But then it seems like, and the same for Aristotle. Aristotle's work is where like the metaphysics and science, proto-science, whatever you want to call it, the idea of deductive reasoning and being objective about how we look at the world, that type of mindset. I was reading in some sources that those books, Aristotle and Galen, are sort of the norm all the way through the Middle Ages, even through the Renaissance period. What are your thoughts on that? Is that true, or is it a little bit more nuanced?
It's a little bit more nuanced, but it's certainly true that, this whole intervening period, and it doesn't really matter whether it's the Latin world or somewhere further afield, they have canonical authors. I mean, this is generally sort of a feature of the pre-modern world that you try to, life is short. You don't have that many books. You try to find who the guy you're supposed to read on a particular topic is. And that's a general, phenomenon. And for Aristotle, right, I mean, his story in the West is a bit interrupted. Boethius realizes it's really worth starting to translate the works of Aristotle, and he gets to some of the texts, like some of the logical works by Aristotle, and then he dies too early to really complete that project. And so very little Aristotle is known in the early Middle Ages, but some of it is known. It's not like a complete wipeout. And then in the 12th century, there are lots of translations made from Arabic and Greek, but mainly from Greek overall. And the whole corpus Aristotelicum, or a large part of it, is back with a vengeance by the beginning of the 13th century. And after some toothing problems, that becomes what is taught at universities if you study arts, right, which is sort of what most people study. They sort of combine the old liberal arts, those 7 disciplines, with reading the Libri Naturalis by Aristotle, all of his more or less scientific writings. And those become huge, but it's not a case where you just have to believe everything Aristotle says. They are more like the beginning of a conversation, right? You read Aristotle, then the master will comment on Aristotle, lecture on the text, maybe write a commentary himself where certain problems are being discussed. And the way scholasticism works with this principle has a lot to do with questioning Aristotle also, and making sure that, they're partially, of course, theological apprehensions, right? I mean, not everything Aristotle writes is compatible with Christian theology, and partially there are other objections to Aristotle's ideas. So it's a very creative interaction. But yeah, Aristotle has the canonical function well into the 16th century. With Galen, it's a bit more complicated. I mean, Galen himself sort of perpetuates the Hippocratic medical tradition, and there's a bit of a break in the way medicine is pursued in the Latin West, to some extent, I guess, also in the Byzantine East, which is that early medieval Christians seem to have been, for whatever reason, not big fans of medical theory. In a way, that's not tragic, because as interesting as ancient Greek medical theory is, it's basically incorrect, right? If you want to be presentist about it, right? These theories are not really a correct description of human physiology or the cause of diseases. And so what early medieval...
No germ theory.
That's right. And what early medieval book scribes and people who compile medical books do is they focus on things that are practically useful. Pharmaceutical recipes, maybe even sort of verbal charms and incantations, right? That those might help as well. And some very brief texts that mostly give you practical advice about dietetics, about sort of how to keep healthy, what to eat at certain times of the year, some forms of prognosis. And there's a very strong practical orientation to the kind of medicine that we see in medieval manuscripts for several centuries. In the 11th century, theoretical medicine makes a comeback in Italy, and that's partially thanks to translations. And what happens subsequently is that the medical culture of the Middle Ages becomes a mixture of Galen, Hippocrates, some other texts, right? There's lots of smaller authors who shouldn't be completely discounted, and Avicenna, right? That's of course, the Persian author from 10th, 11th centuries, who becomes another major sort of pillar of late medieval medical culture. But of course, they're not all worlds apart, right? Even Avicenna fits on to that sort of broadly Hippocratic Galenic spectrum when it comes to his theoretical assumptions, because of course, Galen and Hippocrates were also read in the Islamic world. So it's not just all Galen. He's actually part of a very big patchwork of different authors, but they belong, broadly speaking, to the same tradition, in the same sense that lots of other philosophers are Aristotelian, right? Without necessarily being the same thing.
But so it's sort of true though that Galen can be the final canon of this tradition going back to Hippocrates, Dioscorides, Asclepiades. It's all kind of rolled together into one book. We'll call it Galen, 2nd century AD.
Yep.
Aristotle as well. Aristotle, the tradition of the Aristotelians, the peripatetic school, they call it, that sort of becomes a tradition in itself up until the 2nd century AD. And then those two books are like the pillars of science and medicine going forward till 15th century, maybe? Is that true?
Yeah, well, beyond that, I think in both cases, right, sort of the real upheavals only happen in the 16th century. Yeah, I mean, this is not an incorrect characterization of the intellectual culture of the Middle Ages. What one has to point out, however, is that, none of these authors are followed to the letter in every case. And there are developments starting in the 13th century in Europe where, more dissection is practiced and more attention is paid to areas such as surgery and anatomy, and where sort of new ideas come in, right? And where sort of an autonomous body of knowledge is being put next to these classical texts that keep being foundational texts for university education. And, it's not like all the medical knowledge exhaustively resides in Galen and these other authors. There's new texts being written by European physicians in the 13th to 15th centuries, for instance. So it's more these texts are more like guidelines and starting points, especially in teaching. It's important not to mistake the fact that these are the texts that are taught in universities for the totality of the knowledge that's circulating at any given point in time.
That's interesting. So they sort of become these traditions that get built upon, basically.
Yeah, very much so. Yes, and there's a certain degree of inertia to the way universities, conduct their business. And that's why you see some of the most exciting developments in 16th century science and philosophy happening outside of the universities as a result.
What else can you tell us about the growth of science and maybe some of the myths? I know one of them is, I've heard recently that people say, Galen was the last person who was able to dissect animals, and then Christians outlawed this. And then I've read a peer-reviewed article that said, actually, there's no evidence that Christians ever outlawed doing bodily and cutting or something like that. But not just that topic, like any type of science. What can you tell us about the development of science in this period?
Right. I mean, the 12th century is the big watershed, because in the 12th century, Greek philosophy that wasn't available before, and Greek mathematics and other scientific areas of knowledge were made available again through translation. And many of these translations, in fact, in the more what we would call scientific areas, were from Arabic. This is partially because there were Greek texts available in Arabic, so you did the translation of a Greek text from Arabic as an intermediary. But there were also, of course, lots of authors in the Islamic world who worked on areas such as mathematics and astronomy, and alchemy, and things we might find a bit stranger, like necromancy and astrology and so on. And there was a big hunger for that kind of material, and of course that becomes the foundation for Latin Europeans doing their own thing in these areas and studying astronomy and making maybe their own observations, or at least trying to make sense of all of that and write new treatises and so on. Before the 12th century, it's more difficult. And that's partially because the Latin world, right? Again, we have to bear in mind that these regions of the Latin world, which were often not even part of the Roman Empire to begin with, didn't inherit a lot of Greek thought from Rome that had conquered or not conquered these parts. Philosophy, science, applied mathematics, pure mathematics, these are very Greek disciplines, right? That even in the Latin-speaking part of the Roman world were typically read and taught in Greek without any translations. And so there was a very small base of knowledge that the Latin West could work with to begin with. A lot of it was what we might call encyclopedic. So these were texts that actually took a lot of knowledge from Greek natural philosophy and sort of condensed it into sort of a big summary. Pliny the Elder's Natural History is a very good example of that approach. But what's really crucial for the early medieval period are these texts that essentially represent the liberal arts and that are sort of give it a general idea of what is worth knowing about how the world works. A very good example of that is Martianus Capella's text on the marriage between philology and Mercury, which is a heavily allegorizing and very sort of poetic account of the seven liberal arts. And four of those are, of course, more or less scientific, right? Astronomy, mathematics, geometry, and music. And that was an important basis for how the early Middle Ages as a period understood the world, right? It was like Greek knowledge filtered through these Latin sources. It was very basic, but it wasn't like absurdly basic, right? They had some, for instance, if you look at the cosmological picture that's painted in early medieval Latin sources in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, it is not so dissimilar to like Aristotle and Ptolemy, right? They understand the Earth is a sphere, and they have the sort of the basic Greek cosmology in mind, and they have the theory of the four elements and things of that nature. And then gradually more material comes in, but it's not really until the heightened reception of Aristotelian philosophy, of other forms of Ptolemy, of course. Ptolemy's Almagest is an important work that's translated several times in the 12th century. And without Ptolemy's Almagest, you can't really do much mathematical astronomy. Euclid, right, comes in with a vengeance. There's some Euclid before the 12th century, but only in the 12th century, the full Euclid is available. And this is true of a whole slew of other texts. So the 12th century is the turning point when it comes to, right, people often call this a reintroduction of all of this knowledge. But I and other people would say it's really the first time introduction for many of these regions in Latin Europe that, you know, some of them had never been part of the Roman Empire, some of them only very superficially Romanized. So that the 12th century is a very big deal when it comes to knowledge transfers that happen mostly through Spain and through parts of Italy like Sicily.
Yeah, so they're reintroducing old pagan sources, but to new places that are now part of Europe or the West. Are you familiar with this book, The Wandering Scholars?
Yes, I've never read it, but I know about it. Yeah,
it's pretty interesting. There's like these, and it starts off with 12th century. 12th century is the period, like you mentioned, of this like these humanists who are like, I'm not going to say crypto pagans, but like that'd be a lack of a better term when you describe them. They romanticize the ancient classical sources, and they're really like Petrarch is one of these examples. Petrarch talked about in his book. I think it's a poem that he wrote where he says that he wishes he can take Cicero and avenge his body back from the dead. So just so he can have a conversation with him. And then he says he doesn't know Greek. He's a Latin guy. He said he would look at his library of Greek books and just look at the Greek and fantasize about being able to read it because he loved how beautiful the Greek was. It's very interesting to see that attitude in these Christians. These are humanist Christians, but they love their ancestors who are these Greek pagans.
Yeah, I mean, the Greeks always had a very strong reputation, really throughout the Middle Ages, as being, you know, smart people. And even if Ptolemy wasn't available, his name was known, right? Thanks to various textual traditions. And the same is true of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, right? These are all household names, right? These never disappear as kind of Pythagoras and many other examples. These never disappear as signifiers of wisdom. There's, I think, one interesting difference between the way antiquity is embraced in the 12th century and in the middle of the 14th century with Petrarch, the example you mentioned. For these Renaissance humanists, the important thing they want to get out of classical literature is virtue, ways of good governance, ways of improving yourself morally, ways of making sense of troubled times. The 12th century is more of a hands-on attempt to master nature, to investigate the secrets of nature, understand how matter works, understand, but being able to predict the future, whether astronomically or astrologically or in other ways, right? This is more like a scientific impetus that dominates in the 12th century as far as I can tell, and then there's more like a virtue politics approach that characterizes Renaissance humanism. These are, of course, very, very gross generalizations, and I'm not a fan of generalizing in general. But this is, I think, broadly speaking, how these two Renaissances contrast, because it's hard to deny, just in terms of the sheer number of texts that are introduced, the 12th century sees a Renaissance, or is witness to a Renaissance. It's hard to completely deny that. Sorry. Yeah,
I mean, we found this Antikythera mechanism. It's described as a analog computer because of, you know, it's able to do dials and gears and all this stuff, and it can predict eclipses. Now, what would you say about stuff like this technology as far as the Middle Ages is concerned? Is there a decline in technology? Is there good? Do you have any examples of anything like this? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic topic. Oh, there's so much that one can say. There's sort of an old-fashioned tug of war between people who work on, let's say, Roman technology and people interested in early medieval technology. There's sort of a now partially discredited view which says that actually the early Middle Ages in the Latin West were a much more innovative period because people relied less on slave labor, so they had to use their head to come up with solutions to their practical problems in agriculture and so on. I don't think this is really widely accepted anymore. But still, there are lots of innovations that are associated with even the early Middle Ages, right? Innovations in plow technology and yokes and harnesses and spinning wheels and crop rotation and so on. The Romans had also lots of fascinating technology. Sometimes it's a bit more difficult to trace, but the Antikythera mechanism has a specific history, right? That doesn't really lend itself to generalizing about the overall trajectory in ancient technology. Maybe we should talk about the mechanism a little bit because it's a very instructive example. Also when it comes to the kind of challenges that we face, right? It's sometimes said that the Antikythera mechanism shouldn't exist because it flies in the face of prior assumption about Greek technology. That's not entirely fair, right? Without the mechanism, we would have some idea that, for instance, the ancient Greeks had gears, right? And they employed gears in various technological solutions. There are enough references to this in written sources and so on. But without the Antikythera mechanism, we wouldn't understand the depth or the degree to which engineers in the Hellenistic period had figured out how to do high-precision gear mechanisms that required a lot of mathematical forethought and that employed some really amazing tricks, like, for instance, this pin slot device the mechanism had, which enabled it to simulate anomalous planetary motion. These are things that were not on anybody's bingo cards. And now you have to imagine that all of the things that had to happen for the Antikythera mechanism to survive, right? Somebody had to consign this mechanism as cargo for a ship. That ship had to sink in a place where it would be relatively easy to retrieve or at least find, which eventually happened at the very beginning of the 20th century. Then it had to be retrieved. Then we had to develop the kind of X-ray and scan technology to make sense of these fragments. And then the fragments had to be reconstructed. But if any link in that chain of events doesn't happen, we would still not know about this technology existing in antiquity. The funny thing is, now that we know about the Antikythera mechanism, we can go back to literature from antiquity and find references to it. Those references didn't make sense before, right? They were very vague, but now we can say, okay, he's talking about like the sphere of Archimedes. That's probably something like the Antikythera mechanism. The point is that technology is an extremely hard field to study when it comes to the pre-modern world, because technological artifacts rarely make an imprint in the historical record, right? They're not the kind of artifacts that survive archaeologically. They're rarely written about, right? Most archaeological knowledge that existed in antiquity was just passed on orally. There are some writings on technology, of course. You mentioned Vitruvius, that's an example. And I think Vitruvius also mentions the Archimedes screw that you're just showing us, if I remember correctly. But authors like Vitruvius gloss and skip over lots of really essential stuff that would help us understand these technologies. But to come back to the Antikythera mechanism, right? We don't really know how many of these devices there were, but in antiquity, but probably several. The only example we have probably dates in its original design from the 2nd century BC, but the ship that contained the one specimen we have sank in roughly the middle of the 1st century BC. And then we have exactly one other geared device from all of Greek antiquity, which is a sundial with a gear train attached to it. But that one is dated to around 500 AD, so it's a vastly later object.
That's Dark Ages, so yeah.
Yes. And
quote unquote. So yeah, that doesn't help. Yeah. Okay.
And so the interesting thing about this, sometimes it's called the Byzantine sundial, is that it represents an instrument from the same cognitive or conceptual family of instruments in a very rudimentary, crude kind of execution. What you could do with the sundial is essentially use a gear mechanism to keep track of the days of the week and the dates in the calendar. The Antikythera mechanism is something vastly more sophisticated and it gives you much more data as output. And so the thing is, right, we have these two objects, and because the nature of our knowledge of technology is so contingent on the survival of individual specimens, we can't really make a lot of, it's unclear what we can conclude from these two objects. But at face value, one could say there is a trajectory downwards, like a de-evolution technology, a simplification at any rate. And I think part of the problem with technology is that we always have to think in terms of what kind of purpose did these various doodads and technologies and gizmos actually serve. It's a very different societies from ours, which has lots of economic bottlenecks and constraints. And if you look at the Antikythera mechanism, it's fantastically sophisticated, but in terms of its practical value, it's pretty close to useless as far as we can tell, right? Maybe it's a demonstration tool of some description, something to explain how the planets move, but of course you could draw a diagram, which is not going to be quite as expensive. Maybe it's an astrological prediction mechanism for a very wealthy person who wants to get a daily update on where the planets are so they can make
that makes sense to me.
Which is a form of astrology known as cathartic astrology. But once again, there are certain compromises here to do with the fact that the predictions, the mechanism made were not 100% accurate or even close to it, right? Because the planetary motions are so complicated that you cannot fully capture them by a mechanism like that. So it makes simplifications. Its precision was also limited. And so if somebody wants to have like good astrological data, they would still need like ephemerides, tables that give them daily planetary positions, or they would have to ask an astrologer. So even as a computational device, the idea is really more important than the execution with the Antikythera mechanism. And so you can see how in times of economic hardship, there might not be many people around to commission such a device, right? There will not be many workshops making it, and there will be bottlenecks, right? Somebody who was like the only person in the workshop to really understand every part of the process retires or dies, doesn't pass on all of their knowledge. This happens a couple of generations in a row, and so there are not enough buyers. And maybe the other pressures, like you want to sell more of these kinds of things, then you make them simpler so you can produce more in the same period of time. And that can also compound over time, and you end up with something primitive like this Byzantine sundial I mentioned earlier. So these de-evolution effects with these very complicated technologies can happen in ways that have really nothing to do with broader, it doesn't necessarily indicate some kind of loss of interest in technology or some kind of, intellectual decline. There can be economic pressures on these kinds of things, especially if they're very expensive to make. And of course, some of the loss of maybe Roman architectural prowess and the ability to get certain building projects off the ground are undeniably also the result of changes in the economy and the simplifications in the economy. It doesn't necessarily mean that people, become anti-technology or other things of that nature.
Yeah, you can almost think of a way where this device could be used as a way to sort of, in a subversive way, somebody might be able to predict an eclipse, and then they can tell somebody, oh, look, this eclipse is going to happen, which means if it does, you should listen to what I say, and use it as like some sort of tool for power over people. But that might be thinking way too deeply into it. Like you said, I think a simple way to look at it is this is just elite people with a lot of time and money that just want cool trinkets to have.
Yes. I mean, when it comes to eclipses, of course, the human computer would always beat the Antikythera mechanism in terms of success rate, because the mechanism has to make certain compromises for it to work. Well, similar devices in the sense of highly complicated gear trains used to kind of simulate planetary motions come back visibly for us in the 14th century. Right, the two famous examples would be Richard of Wallingford's sort of planetary or planetarium clock for St. Albans Abbey, which was made, I think, in the 1320s, something like that. And the other is from the middle of the 14th century by Giovanni de Dondi, who was somebody based in Padua, and he made sort of a miniature mechanical clock that also was essentially a kind of planetarium orrery. And those were very famous in their day. And of course, the great advantage of these later medieval innovations is that they were self-perpetuating to some extent, right? The Antikythera mechanism has to be cranked by hand. And it actually is very unwieldy. You have to crank it dozens of times to make it move significantly, right? Because of the way that the mechanism works. Whereas these late medieval clocks, they had a virgin folio or some other escapement mechanism that enabled them to work like clocks without human energy transfer. And I think that makes the idea of such a mechanism much more appealing, because you can just walk past it and see how or how over time the moon changes its position, and how there's even a tidal prediction mechanism in the St. Albans clock and things like that. So maybe it's like the invention of the mechanical clock that really made these devices attractive again.
Yeah, I was talking to an archaeologist who's done work in Egypt and Alexandria, and apparently, I actually found something that just shows this. In Alexandria, in the Hellenistic period, I think maybe early Roman period, actually it says down here, Heron of Alexandria, 10 to 70, Greek-Egyptian mathematician and inventor, lived in Roman Egypt, was a representative of Hellenistic science, invented a steam-powered engine called the Hero engine, aeolipile, a wind wheel, then a vending machine. This is what the scholar told me about too. There was vending machines, and even a pantograph. And he was experimenting with other steam-powered devices as well. One of his inventions was automatic door openings, automatically opening temple doors, powered by a fire altar and a hydraulic system. So this is what they've dug up in these archaeological digs, evidence of this. Now, is there anything even? I know this for a fact that in the 13th century, I'm just going to pull up something else real quick. In the 13th century, you start seeing these cities that do use hydraulic technology. This is from what city is this? This is from Alhambra, the Alhambra Palace in Granada. And they have an entire system of plumbing that goes, they have like a dam they built, and they use animals. Look at this. This is crazy technology in the 13th century. So yeah, there's no way the Dark Ages goes to past this period. No way. But I was wondering, is there anything like this in between Alexandria, Egypt, and this 13th century marvel? What do you, yeah.
To some extent, I mean, one of the elements in this animation is, of course, a kind of water gear mechanism for transporting water. Those kind of gear mechanisms go back a long time, as far as I can tell, right? Because there are lots of water mills and windmills and things of that nature in Europe. When it comes to hydraulics, there's probably less of that. I mean, I'm that's not really my wheelhouse. I don't know. The kind of marvels that Hero of Alexandria describes in his treatises, there is barely evidence of them in medieval Europe. That's for sure. And of course, Hero's works were also not known on the whole. The question is, of course, what could Hero actually do with, for instance, the aeolipile and things of that nature, right? There may have been sort of practical limitations to the way they were used. But yeah, overall, there are certainly examples of ancient technology that disappeared in the Middle Ages, as far as we can tell, right? Again, the nature of our evidence is very limited. But that is true for these kinds of, what you're showing here from Granada is a good example. The question is, of course, how widespread were those even in these instances, right? Do you only find them attached to like a court or to one particular center, or are these technologies that are in wide use? That's another example, because, for instance, mechanical clocks that come in the 13th century in Europe, they spread very far and wide all across the continent very quickly. So you actually have like a lot of coverage in the way you can trace that technology in the 13th, 14th, especially 14th and 15th centuries. It's much harder for some of these mechanical marvels that are described, for instance, in treatises from the Islamic world, where you only have evidence for the use in one particular place in some cases. But yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, because the history of technology is really difficult to be confident about, because we don't know what we don't know a lot of the time. But yeah, overall, undeniably, there's less of this sort of let's say high-end technology in early medieval Europe.
You bring up an interesting point, because there might be two ways of measuring dark versus light, or a good time versus a bad time, which are just like it's kind of subjective how we measure these things, right? Depending on what your interests are. Are you interested in literature? Then you're going to think the Dark Ages were dark. Are you interested in society taking care of the poor and that type of thing? Then you're going to think the Dark Ages were better than the classical period. But another way to the two things that I'm seeing, was one way of measuring, is it do we measure the aristocracy? Do we measure the top? And then let's say there's a society where on the top of the pyramid, you have this extremely wealthy class very small population of really high wealthy class aristocracy. They're very educated. They're producing Antikythera mechanisms. They're producing water systems and all this stuff. But then all the slave population, everyone behind under them is all like living in poverty. Then is it really a dark age or is it a light age? Depends on what you think. Are you measuring the top or are you measuring the bottom? Or the opposite might be everyone's kind of well off and there's no starvation, there's no hunger, and everyone kind of is like, the society is nice and well together and people are taking care of each other and there's not a lot of wars, but the aristocracy is not thriving and they're not producing technology, they're not producing. So then it's like, how are we measuring? Are we measuring from the bottom or are we measuring from the top? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I think what you touch upon here is one of the number one reasons why historians right now, and also really over the past couple of generations, are not fans of the term Dark Ages, because of course it's a value judgment, and the obvious objection to these kinds of value judgments is according to what sort of set of criteria are you making that judgment, and who is it the Dark Age for, right? That's sort of a classic objection. And you can go even further, right? We now live in a society, quote unquote, where a lot of people have vastly diverging opinions as to what is even good in life, right? And what we should strive for, especially in these times where so many people worry about anthropogenic climate change, right? You now get historians who look at, a period like the 6th, 7th century, and they see the good in the fact that there's like, population decline and deurbanization and people living in smaller communities where there's maybe even more egalitarianism than in more complex societies, right? They look at this in a more sort of anarcho-primitivist way. I'm not suggesting that one should, but as an historian, you also have to work with these people and see them as your colleagues. And so why would you bicker over whether a particular period is dark or not if people can have such very starkly diverging opinions as to what is positive and negative? That's certainly one reason. Another point when it comes to the term Dark Ages, right? Because sometimes people wonder, why have historians stopped using the term, which is something that started happening a long time ago. Another is, of course, sort of this methodological precept that you're not supposed to assume your conclusion, right? Again, the nature of our knowledge is very contingent on the evidence we have. Sometimes new evidence comes in. Sometimes old evidence turns out to be less reliable, or maybe it's been interpreted the wrong way. The point is, you don't want to approach your period assuming you already know everything about it, or you know what the main plot points are going to be. If you assume this period is like the absolute pits, it's the Dark Ages, and you have one source that you can interpret two ways, it might really skew the way you interpret the source, and then your reasoning is circular because you use that interpretation to prop up the fact it's the Dark Ages and so on. And there are real life examples of that sort of thing. So methodologically also, that's the reason the term is not very popular. Historians don't reject the term just because they have a different opinion as to what happened. That's not really the case. Of course, they don't like it when terms are so overly dramatic and pearl-clutching that they make people assume the worst, right? That's not a good thing either. But it's really more a methodological objection for most of us, and not a case of thinking, oh yeah, the 6th, 7th, 8th century were the pinnacle of human civilization. That's not why the term has become unpopular.
Yeah, it's not because it's the light ages. It's because the term Dark Ages is very it's not nuanced. It carries a sort of dogma in itself that you're already assuming things. Plus, on top of that, where are we drawing the line as far as what region are we talking about? Are we stopping at Babylon and we're just going west of Babylon? Are we stopping at Constantinople? Are we stopping in Syria? Where are we starting this? Because China had a whole different period going on, and it wasn't the same as going. The Han Dynasty in the 200s AD was not the same as what was going on in Rome, right?
100%.
And so, yeah. So you can't just say, you can use the term medieval period. It's the middle period, you can use the term modern period because it applies to all. But once you start talking about dark versus light, you're getting very specific, and it's like, what place are you talking about? Are you talking about Constantinople? There might have been, from what I've read, in the Byzantine period, there was a Macedonian Renaissance in the 11th or 9th or 10th or something century. And then you have the Frankish Renaissance in the 10th century. And then there's like little renaissances happening in little pockets of the West. So the term, this is why I understand why the term Dark Ages is very problematic. Because what period, what region, what city, who are you talking about? Everything changes even by decade. Every decade is different. You have to look at things one at a time.
Absolutely, very much so. Yes, the Macedonian Renaissance is a good example for the Byzantine context. Of course, in the early Middle Ages, you've got the Carolingian Renaissance, which is drastically important for the preservation of classical literature, and it's really impressive if you look at the surviving Latin books that we have. Right? Maybe I should drop those numbers real quick. Right? We have very roughly 10,000 surviving Latin books or book fragments that were produced up to the year 900. 10,000 is a ballpark figure, and about 8,000 of those are from the 9th century. So only the other 2,000 or so, or slightly less than 2,000, go up to 800. But even of those, maybe 1,900, about a third are from the Carolingian period. So the Carolingian period really changes the game when it comes to our access to books that we can actually study. This might partially be sort of a distorting lens, right? Because maybe those books were copied from earlier books that then got thrown out, and as a result, we have less from the previous periods. There's a big shift in script that's being used in the early Carolingian period, right? There's this switch to Carolingian minuscule, which had a huge influence on the way we still use typefaces today. And all the new books or most of them were produced in this new script, which is itself a bit of a bottleneck. And something very similar happens to minuscule script in the Byzantine Empire around the same time. But yeah, you've got many renaissances even before that, right? There's, of course, the Vandals are a famous example, right? They take over North Africa, and in traditional historiography, they're associated with, tearing things down and smashing things, right? That's where we got the term vandalism from. But in fact, there was a thriving literary culture during Vandal rule over North Africa, to the extent that some people say, or use the term Vandal Renaissance to refer to, that sort of relative density of Latin writers that are active in the late 5th, early 6th century North Africa. Yeah, to cut a long story short, some regions are always going to be treated very unfairly, even if you just limit Dark Ages to Latin Europe, right? Some people would say the Dark Ages don't get darker than in the 7th century, but even then you've got Isidore of Seville, who obviously has access to a big library in the Visigothic kingdom, and even the Visigothic king Sigebert writes poetry and so on. Some regions are always going to do worse according to certain metrics than others. And what's also important to me is sometimes to point out that parts of Europe that were never part of the Roman Empire, and the fall of the Roman Empire made very little difference to them in terms of their material culture or access to education, right? Think about the Vikings in the north, or the Baltics, or regions like that. That's still Europe, but it doesn't fit that Dark Age paradigm at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then you even have the architecture of these Vandals and Goths that is pretty. They know how to build nice, beautiful architecture. So you need math and science for that. You need some sort of trained, educated class to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a strong sense of continuity on a cultural level between the no longer existing Western Roman Empire and the so-called barbarian kingdoms. We see this in Spain, we see this in North Africa, in Italy as well with the Ostrogoths, right? Theodoric was famously, very adept at sort of continuing Roman structures of administration and Roman cultural politics and things of that nature. There's a very good book by Yitzhak Hen, which came out in 2007, called Roman Barbarians, where he describes the cultural politics of these different barbarian kingdoms, also the Merovingians, of course. And one case he makes is that there is this cliched view that as soon as the Roman Empire ends, education, literacy is completely in the hands of the church. And this is to an extent misconstruing the fact that there are still political structures here that had an investment in continuing traditions that already existed in the Western Roman Empire. They had rulers who wanted to be seen as stewards of literacy, stewards of literary production. They wanted to be seen as cultured and Roman. And there's often an older view of the early Middle Ages that's completely blind to the fact that some of these barbarian rulers were actually educated people who understood the value of what Rome had given them, right, as a cultural heritage, the inheritance of Rome. That's, of course, Chris Wickham's book, the title of it. And I think now we take the idea more seriously that what came after in political terms was often quite consciously Roman in the way they approach politics and culture.
I think if you're going to try to make a term or period that's the dark, quote unquote, Dark Ages, you kind of have to slide it back and include the 3rd century. You kind of have to go, Well, after the Severan period, there was this collapse. And then, for example, I'm just going to show the map that I found real quick. This crisis is the 3rd century. You get this like flip of the Gallics over here, Palmyreans over here. And then it seems to be, from my understanding, that things never really got back on track after this, for as far as Rome is concerned. I'm not talking about the world. The world is going to have ups and downs regardless. But as far as Rome, if you're using Rome as the measure, the Roman Empire never really is ever, after this, it's downhill. So I think if you're going to pick a period and call it the Dark Ages, I would slide it to 235 to around 750. Because then you have the Carolingian Renaissance, and then it's over, and then everything starts getting better. And this is all simplistic. I understand this is very oversimplifying, but I'm saying if you're going to try to use it, I think you have to slide it back a century or two.
I don't think that's simplistic. I mean, what you are sort of pointing out here and what you're sort of suggesting as a chronological range comes extremely close to what sort of modern academic historians who actually do work in these areas, to the way they would prefer their history to be periodized, right? There's now this I'm not sure it's a consensus view, but it's a common approach to say roughly from 200 to 800, you have like a period that's self-contained in the sense that it's the period when the Roman Empire changes into something else. It's the transformation of the Roman Empire period that comes to its conclusion with Charlemagne, essentially. Somebody would say maybe with Muhammad, right, with the rise of Islam, but it's a long period where you see things shift very slowly. Then in between, there are like ruptures that happen much more quickly and more catastrophically, right? Bad things are happening in the 5th and 6th centuries, barbarian invasions and plague and so on. But overall, they are on the level of culture and how administration works and how the economy in the Mediterranean is organized and functions. There is a lot of continuity where the changes happen much more gradually. But my own impression, based on all my reading, agrees with your assessment that the Roman Empire doesn't recover from the 3rd century.
There's this idea of book burning and book production. What's the truth about this? Are they producing? Are they burning? What's going on here?
So, I mean, overall, this is a difficult topic to assess because there's a recency bias, right? You always tend to have more books from a more recent period than from an older period, because books have for papyrus, it's very bad to begin with, right? If you go back further in antiquity, papyrus doesn't last that long. I mean, there are conditions in which it can be preserved for a very long time. We do have papyrus that's been stored in Ravenna since the 6th century or so. But overall, it survives better in very dry, arid regions. That's why most of our papyrus fragments are from parts of Egypt, like from the Fayum and from Oxyrhynchus. But if it's Alexandria, where it's rather humid and you're close to the sea, a papyrus scroll might really get quite damaged after 2-3 centuries, especially if it's used a lot. And so these need to be replaced a lot. And that's one of the factors that leads to the loss of information long before all of these crises we've been talking about, right? This is something that goes on throughout antiquity. All these factors that can lead to the loss of books are in place, like background noise in the preprint, pre-industrial world. And then from the 1st century onwards, you can see how additional bottlenecks kind of start forming. And one of them is this transition from two transitions, really. One is from scroll to codex, and one is from papyrus to parchment as the main physical medium that's used to transmit literature. Papyrus has the advantage that if the economy in the Roman Empire works the way it's supposed to be, I guess, you can easily get access to papyrus because it's being shipped out of Egypt all the time. If that breaks down, it's going to be more difficult to source. And the advantage of parchment is that you've got animals everywhere, and cattle and goats and sheep, and you can use those skins to make books. But the process is more laborious to create these parchment sheets. And so overall, it's a more expensive medium. This is slightly mitigated by the fact that you can write more words in a parchment codex than you can write on a scroll. But that creates a bottleneck because everything that existed previously in scroll format has to be copied into a parchment codex eventually for it to be preserved. That's one, and there's just if the economic circumstances are not ideal, then simply fewer books will be preserved if all you have are parchment codices. So the bottleneck becomes tighter. Christianity creates another bottleneck, undeniably, because reading tastes are changing. Right, certain texts are more valued than valued more highly than others. You could not possibly write Christianity out of this story while certain literature gets lost or certain forms of literature gets lost. It's still amazing how much we have. You have to bear in mind there are world literatures that have been much more severely affected by, time. Think about Middle Persian literature, how little we have in terms of Middle Persian literature that's not religious, hardly anything, but we know that they produced their own histories and other things, right, that we would like to have, but we don't. Then, of course, you have upheavals towards the end of antiquity, and partly thanks to the economic situation, the fact that parchment is expensive and difficult to produce, book production takes a real hit. And what you see in the 6th, 7th, early 8th century is that lots of palimpsests are made in the Latin world. So where an existing book is essentially where the writing is washed off or more rarely scraped off, and another book is written on top of it. And in the 18th and 19th century, scholars made huge efforts to recover these texts because it turned out that a lot of these older layers of palimpsests are extremely, for us, valuable classical literature. The most famous example would be like Cicero's On the Republic, where we have most of the text only in palimpsest form as an older layer. And there are other examples like this. And if you have a broad definition of classical Latin literature, and you look at all of these palimpsests that are older than, let's say, the year 800, an astonishing number of them survive only as palimpsests. Like, I think one number I have in mind is that, overall, maybe 4 to 5% of all books that have survived up to 800 have a palimpsest layer that's older than 800, and about 20 to 25% of those are classical texts on a wide definition that would include like sort of practical technical literature. And so sometimes people use those kind of statistics to say, well, they were really recklessly getting rid of pagan literature and writing their own sort of Christian literature on top of it. But that's very misleading for several reasons. First of all, you also have to look at the other 3/4 of palimpsest literature and its Bibles and liturgy and church fathers. So they get washed off and written over as well. There are obviously other reasons why this kind of literature gets palimpsested. And the reasons are actually not that difficult to figure out if you look at these books more closely. Partially it's because scripts change, and some of these books are written in scripts that are no longer in use or are regarded to be more difficult to read. So a new copy is made and the old one gets recycled. Another big factor is that sometimes books still get kind of dilapidated or damaged. And so you recycle the paper or parchment in some way. And one reason why maybe in the 7th century, for instance, there are so many palimpsests from classical literature relative to everything else is plausible because these palimpsests come from Italy, mostly, right? That's the single most important region for these Latin palimpsests. And in the 6th century, libraries have a very bad time in Italy. Plausibly, lots of libraries get kind of despoiled or dilapidated as a result of these wars. And if you look at the lower layers of these manuscripts, they're often actually just a couple of sheets from different manuscripts. Not a whole book that gets recycled, but surviving fragments of books. And there are even signs of damage sometimes. And it's very plausible that these are kind of, these palimpsested books are debris from destroyed libraries that have fallen into disrepair. And the reason why the Italians, like the Italian monasteries, had so much Cicero and other classical authors to recycle is because this is more or less, the waste that's created by these upheavals. And you have to be very careful in drawing conclusions. So, for instance, close to a third of all of these Italian palimpsests, or I think even in general, come from one monastery, Bobbio. And we know for a fact that when, for instance, they're recycling Lucanus's big poem on the Roman Civil War, they have another copy of that. They're not palimpsesting that because they don't care about the text. They just have another copy, and one of them gets recycled. So this is not necessarily an act of vandalism to make palimpsests. It's a sign partially of the extreme scarcity of parchment that incentivizes recycling, and it's partially, cases where recycling is just the obvious thing to do if a book is damaged or you don't have the whole thing anymore. And some of it is media change to do with changing scripts. So initially, it sounds extremely tragic or like drastic, the degree to which classical literature in this period gets recycled. But there's a bigger picture that suggests that this can actually coexist with an actual preservation or appreciation for a lot of this literature. I'm just saying this because there are sort of narratives surrounding palimpsests that are sometimes used as, the smoking gun for the destruction of classical literature by ignorant monks and things of that nature.
How did that make that argument? I'm not really sure what that makes sense to me.
Well, for instance, Dirk Roman in this book that we talked about earlier off air, he essentially counts all the palimpsests of classical authors, and very rightly says that almost all of the copies of classical authors that we know were produced in the 5th, 6th, the 6th and 7th and early 8th centuries are palimpsests, right? Only a tiny handful, in this period from 550 to 750, I think there are only 2 non-palimpsested copies of classical Latin texts, if you have a very narrow definition of high literature. And all the others are palimpsested older layers. And so on that basis, right, if you just look at these sheer numbers, it looks like, wow, they just systematically scraped off or washed off these old pagan texts and wrote something else on top of them. But you need a bigger picture. You need to look at where these palimpsests were made. You need to look at all the other palimpsests to get a sense of scale. And all of a sudden, it doesn't look that bad anymore.
That is I never even thought about that. So they're recycling old parchment. Is that what, or is it papyri?
Yeah, old parchment.
Yeah, and they're okay.
Off, yeah.
But here's one of the things that I noticed too, because this is something that I agree with the anti-Dark Ages people on, is this idea that we lost all the pagan literature and there was like a systematic decree to get rid of them all. They're all like Tertullian's attitude. Like, you don't need the Athens. We got Jerusalem. That type of attitude was not popular. In fact, the Christians were actually very literary. The religion itself is based on typology of the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's a very literary religion itself. You're digging into the Old Testament and looking for prophecies for Jesus. And so it has a very literary culture, a part of it. So it is very textual. They're trying to preserve text. They're trying to preserve the ancient writers. Eusebius loved the pagans. Eusebius wrote a whole book called the Evangelica Preparatio Evangelica, where he argues that the pagans were divinely inspired too. Like, give me any pagan text. I'll show you where Jesus is in there. He makes these awesome, I think, interesting arguments, pulling from Porphyry, pulling from whoever, and just showing like they're pointing to Jesus. So like there was this on the people who are like the librarian types, Eusebius, Epiphanius, for example, they did want to preserve all these other sources. Well, Epiphanius and Eusebius are like the 2 prime examples of sources that preserve texts that are lost anywhere else. Like you have to go to Eusebius for certain sources, especially the Phoenician history source. You have to go to Eusebius for that. And so they are actually preserving, and it's the fact that we have Homer today, the fact that we have Aristotle and Plato and Euripides and Aeschylus and Cicero and Ovid and Virgil does sort of attest to the culture of the Christians that they did want to preserve these texts. Or else, if that was true, then why am I able to read Homer today? Why am I able to read Cicero? Because they preserved them. And I give them credit for that. That was one of the things that I think Christianity did that everyone should be happy for. They preserved almost that. They preserved as much as you can. It doesn't seem like there's a systematic way of trying to get rid of pagan authors.
Yeah, this is all. I agree with all of this. I think I can offer a couple of remarks that might be useful. First of all, in a paradoxical way, it's both true that the scale of the loss is absolutely devastating, right? I mean, estimates diverge, but I wouldn't be surprised if what we have in terms of classical Greek literature is less than 2% of the total output. If you count everything written down, of course, it's way below 1% because of the documentary sources, but that's almost like a pointless argument. But when it comes to literary output, 2% may well be optimistic. I mean, given like Reviel Netz's recent work, of course, what we have maps onto the canon in the sense that we probably still get the cream of the crop of antiquity in terms of the important texts. And still, and I agree also with your point in the sense that other forms of world literature have fared much more badly. I think, if you think about ancient sort of cultures vanishing and their literary heritage vanishing, then Greece and Rome are not as badly affected as others.
Right. Persia. You pointed out Persia.
Persia,
We have nothing before. What's his Federosi, who drove the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It's like a 10th century source.
right? Yeah.
That's like the only text you can find about the ancient Persian history.
Yeah.
There's nothing. They did not, and you cannot blame the West for that. That's Persia not preserving their own history. So I don't know what happened there, but in comparison to Persia, the West did a good job of preserving, as you mentioned, the cream of the crop. Because you mentioned, I didn't know it was low as 2%. I thought it was more like I thought it was like we lost more than half or something. But you're saying we lost 98%?
Well, it depends a bit on what you're counting. Are you counting like just words that were written, or are you counting authors, right? For authors, it doesn't look quite as bad. But still, I mean, the more evidence comes out in terms of, you can, for instance, count authors that are mentioned on inscriptions or in papyri that you don't have any other evidence for. It looks actually worse now than it maybe looked a couple of decades ago based on new research, right? I mean, I'm going mostly by Reviel Netz's data. But it's not surprising. I mean,
what is it? Is there an article that you're referring to that I can refer my audience to?
So the key book at the moment, I would guess, is called, I think it's called Scale, Space, and Canon in Ancient Literature. It came out in 2020, and Netz works a lot with papyrus evidence. But Netz is actually on the. I mean, he actually agrees with us that it's still remarkable how much has survived. I mean, Netz's point is that in the classical and Hellenistic period, the Greeks just were a very, very literate people. But he would also argue that. Already by 8200, maybe only a third of all of that stuff was still around. So it's not like it all, survived until the end. Exactly, that's the book, until the end of the classical period. But he estimates that by 8200, maybe as many as 30,000 Greeks might have written a work of literature of some description, and maybe as many as 10,000 of those were still in circulation. I mean, he's not asking us to take his numbers at face value. It's just, essentially, working from what we have and extrapolating based on different scenarios. And he doesn't actually have a very negative assessment of the role of later centuries in preserving this, but he just emphasizes that they produced a lot of literature that we no longer have, and maybe even more than we ever anticipated.
Well, I was going to say, too, because I don't know if this is one of the most popular texts, Diogenes Laertius. Everyone knows this text. But if you read what he says, every person he talks about in here, Heraclides, Plato, Xenophon, Socrates, you can go to the end of his little biography, and he gives a list of their writings. And I've tried to hunt these down. Almost none of them exist. Yeah. To the point where I was even questioning, are these real? And I've talked to scholars who says, yes, these probably were real texts. Maybe not all of them, but for the most part, they're citing actual sources that we just lost.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that makes a good. I didn't even think about the scale until you mentioned it.
Yeah, so that's an interesting book to sample, but it's a huge book. It's dense, right? It's like 900 pages, full of attempts to come up with statistics. But it's really interesting, especially when it comes to learning what the canon was, how it was composed in the course of Greek antiquity, and how certain authors beat other authors in terms of popularity. Another point I wanted to make, because it is a way of steelmanning the Dark Ages argument for roughly the middle of the 6th to the middle of the 8th centuries. And it goes as follows, right? In the Carolingian period, one reason the Carolingian period doesn't look very dark is because they copy so many classical texts, and that they're so important for preserving those texts. But in many cases where we can make a reconstruction of that sort, it looks like the book that was copied by a Carolingian scribe is a book from the 4th or 5th centuries. These are often very large-scale, lavishly produced codices that are using scripts that are known as rustic capitals or uncial. These are kinds of scripts that waste a lot of space, right? These are very large letters, and you don't get many sentences on the page. And these kind of monumental codices, sometimes very nicely illustrated, are sometimes demonstrably the source for Carolingian manuscripts. And there's a question to which degree the Carolingians used any intermediary copies. Maybe not that many, because our problem is that when it comes to like books from the 7th and 8th centuries, if they're classical, they tend to be palimpsested, right? And there's not much direct evidence that a lot of was copied in that period. You still have to be cautious, right? Because you have authors like, for instance, the Venerable Bede, one example of somebody who wrote a lot and obviously had read a lot of classical literature, including a lot of literature, including classics, like he's read Pliny, comes to mind, and Vegetius and others. So they obviously had access to stuff that we can't otherwise trace. But there's an open question whether the intervening centuries between, let's say, the year 500 and the Carolingians were really big into preserving classical literature. Maybe some of those books only made it to 800 by the skin of their teeth. I think there are reasons to be a bit more optimistic because we have glimpses of a literary culture in Merovingian Gaul. And the question, of course, is also to which degree the Carolingians just recycled or threw away earlier manuscripts because around the year 800, manuscripts become very uniform, right? There's a certain way in which they're produced. There's a certain script that's used, Caroline Minuscule. These manuscripts are often easier to write and especially easier to read because this change in script also goes hand in hand with clearer norms when it comes to word division, punctuation, right? These are just more appealing, easier to digest forms of presentation. And maybe some of those Merovingian manuscripts of classical literature got thrown out because they no longer conform to those norms. These are all sort of unknowns you have to bear in mind before sort of, in a very sort of offhand and facile way condemning the previous centuries as Dark Ages. But if the evidence that we have is all we base our judgment on, then it looks a bit dismal, unfortunately.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, do you think based on the sample size, even if it's only 2%, you can still get a decent enough picture? Like just based on that 2%, we're zooming in, we got this 2% of the text. But then you look at that 2%, and it's still a lot of sources. We still have quite a few books of Homer, quite a few books of Euripides, you have Aristophanes, and you have all these, Catullus and Theocritus and whatever, all Apollodorus. And you can kind of look at in these sources and sort of get a good reading on what the culture was like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point to make, right? Because I think one misconception is that the survival of Latin literature is kind of, of Greek or any ancient literature is kind of random, and it's sort of, a pixel here, a pixel there, and we get like authors that don't represent their time at all, and then maybe a glimpse of somebody who's really important. Netz, who comes up with these estimates that suggest that we have like dramatic losses, also argues in the same book that as far as our understanding of Greek literature and its canon is concerned, it's more or less intact, right? We do have a good and a full picture. It's not like we only glimpse, through a glass darkly when it comes to Greek antiquity and what their literature was like and what these people thought. We actually have a good understanding because the essentials got preserved. That's Netz's own argument.
Yeah, because when you read Herodotus and you read these sources from the ancient world, they're all citing each other, and it's an interweb of texts that are all mentioning each other. Hecataeus of Miletus is mentioned by Herodotus, and then Thucydides mentions Herodotus, and then a later historian mentions Thucydides. Diodorus mentions all of them. You can see you get enough from the little sample size we have of what was happening. For example, we're not getting a bunch of citations of these authors that we lost and going, what did he say? Like there's enough there where we can kind of go, all right, we can get a good grasp on what's being said and what's being done and what the culture was like, what religion was like, all those things.
Yes, absolutely. And for some of those really dark centuries where we have very little like historiography, we still get a lot out of physical books, right? That's where the physical books are very helpful. They might not contain works of history, but all sorts of other things that sometimes relate to daily life. And one point that's important to me also when it comes to the term Dark Ages is that the term Dark Ages was to a certain extent institutionalized in the 19th century because there were certain centuries, especially for British historians, where just very little material survived, right? If you look at British history in centuries after the Roman withdrawal, like the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, part of the reason it looked dark to the 19th century is because of an absence of information, right? It's the epistemic darkness that's crucial here. But a lot of this is now no longer sort of relevant because we have so much archaeological evidence. from these periods, and archaeology is making huge strides in opening just new vistas for us, right? With DNA analysis, stable isotope analysis, looking at the tooth enamel of people and all of these sorts of things. And we also have more written sources now. So part of the reason historians don't like the Dark Ages term too much is because, they think quite rightly that we've made some progress since the 19th century.
I wanted to ask you about this book. I was able to read quite a big chunk of it, a lot of it. Yeah. Christianity, book burning, and censorship in late antiquity. And then there's a quote that I wanted to go off of page 17 and get your thoughts on just this and the book in general and what you disagree with and all that stuff. He writes, the reliability of these accounts, however, talking about book burning, is often questionable. In these reported cases of book burning, magic books again predominate, as these books were believed to be powerful. The sources sometimes put magic books on a par with an unspecific range of pagan books without distinction. Nevertheless, as evidence in the life of Porphyry, it is clear that pagan ritual books were destroyed. What do you think about the book burning thing? Is it something that was very common? Is it something that we sort of over mythologize? What are your thoughts on this book in general?
It may be over mythologized. I think there are types of literature where book burnings are not only attested, but also probably played an important role in why certain literature doesn't survive. The most obvious example would be heretical texts, right? Christians getting rid of forms of Christianity they don't agree with. This is something that is, I think, uncontroversially something that's happening in late antiquity. And for instance, exactly. And then there's, of course, this larger complex of what you might call pagan religion, where it's not quite clear what belongs to it, right? There are ritual texts that describe how to perform certain rituals or sacrifices, and we have very, very little of that. And again, this is not something that made it through the Christian bottleneck in one way or another, whether it was actively destroyed or no longer passed on. Is almost irrelevant when it comes to preservation. But yeah, I think there's probably a book burning makes sense here, and I think Roman gives some indications of how this happened, and maybe magic and astrology also belong to that wider halo of what might count as pagan. There are problems with Roman's approach sometimes because he might be using sort of a narrative hagiographic source as evidence, but it's not always clear whether the things that are described in this are actually happened or happened widely. Sources always have to, of course, be scrutinized from various angles to look into, who's the audience for these texts and how did the author know what he's writing about and so on. Just basic source criticism that doesn't always happen in this book. Also, when it comes to legal sources, I mean, I'm briefly say what I like about the book. It's very comprehensive, right? It's really an attempt to give a panoramic overview of what we can say reasonably about the degree to which Christians contributed to the disappearance of classical literature. And he makes the case for what's actually an unpopular opinion, right? This is not like the consensus view. He tries to steelman this unpopular opinion that actually Christianity contributed.
I love people that do that, exactly. By the way. I'm into that stuff.
Yeah, that's useful to every historian. Even if I don't agree with that, I want to read that to see how far can you push the argument to make the case for the prosecution that Christians actually purposefully got rid of a lot of stuff. And there are parts of the book that are more convincing than others. A slight problem that sometimes arises is that, there's lots of literature on some of these questions. Some of it isn't really taken into account, right? Some counter arguments are sometimes left out. There's a last chapter in the book where he deals with the early Middle Ages, which is obviously not his wheelhouse, and some strange things ensue from that. I talked about the way the palimpsests are treated. There's something slightly weirder here, where there's a longer passage where he argues that there was a community of Italian pagans in exile in Ireland who preserved classical literature, and the reason we have some classical texts is because they were brought back from Ireland to, let's say, 8th or 9th century Europe. And this is, I think most historians who know this period think this is very strange. There's no evidence for this. It's not quite clear why he thinks that's true. It's partially based on reading a source called the Hesperica Famina, which is a 7th century Hiberno-Latin texts, so produced in Ireland, and I think pretty much anybody who's familiar with the text would say, okay, these are Irish monks writing that literature. It's not evidence of paganism. But yeah, he's got some strange ideas also about the transmission of Lucretius and about Hypatia of Alexandria being a heliocentrist. They're just passages in the book that
really,
yeah, he goes off the deep end sometimes. I mean, I'm not a fan of.
Well, this is De Gruyter. So De Gruyter is like a heavy peer-reviewed academic publisher.
Yes.
Does anyone question how he got this stuff to come through if it's not true?
Not publicly. I mean, the reviews of the book are overall not terrible. Most of them are a bit critical and point out certain things, but I think one of the things that makes it so hard sometimes for quality control to really work perfectly is because some books cover so many different areas of expertise, and most people only have a small wheelhouse. I mean, a real wheelhouse is always going to be small because there's so much to know. And so you might be able to pick up on flaws in one area, maybe how an author treats legal texts, but you don't notice the flaws in other areas. I come more at this from a history of science point of view, right? So when somebody tells me that there's potentially evidence that Synesius and Hypatia were covert heliocentrists because of this and that reason, and I might realize very easily this cannot possibly be true. And then there are other flaws that I would. Oh yeah, that's the passage actually.
Yeah. Can I read it real quick?
Yeah, sure.
So it says, I'll start up here. I'll just start the whole thing. Hypatia's astronomical research could be of interest to explain the mystery, but the evidence supporting such a view remains obscure to us. However, it is known that she worked on an edition of Claudius Ptolemy's Almagest, while her father Theon, the last member known from Alexandria's Musaeon, worked on a commentary on the Almagest. She also maintained astrolabes for research on the stars. Ptolemy's Almagest famously interpreted the Earth as the center of the solar system and came to be accepted as the standard book on astronomy throughout the Middle Ages. Research in the early 19th and again in the 20th century showed it to be a spectacular case of plagiarism, as Ptolemy had borrowed earlier computations based on the heliocentric system, although he claimed to have used his own computations. The idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but moves around in a perpetual motion, weakens the likelihood that the world is perishing soon. Synesius' correspondence indicates that that ideas such as these were discussed between Hypatia and her students, and that notebooks containing these ideas were exchanged among them. In the next section, we will see that Christian authors seem to have welcomed the destruction of pagan institutions. So he's saying that in this source right here, Synesius, that's where we find the evidence for it?
Yeah. So if you scroll up, I mean, thanks very much for reading that. It's a really interesting passage that I think sort of maybe gives a sense of the scale of the problem. So if you look at the paragraph above it, right, he's already talked about Synesius. That is a former student of Hypatia who became a bishop in Ptolemais in North Africa. And he's one of our most important sources for knowing who Hypatia was, or knowing something about her beyond like general descriptions of her life, because he wrote letters to her. And in one of his letters that are not addressed at Hypatia, that are part of his overall correspondence, he talks about him having certain opinions that people in his environment don't approve of. And one of them had to do with the question whether the world is going to perish soon or not. And so if you look at that passage, the first step in Roman's argument on that page is to say, well, Synesius apparently had views similar to John Philoponus. Now, John Philoponus is an Alexandrian philosopher from the 6th century. And so there's a sentence here saying Philoponus argued that the world is eternal, that the stars and planets move dynamically. And then he mentions, now I can't see it anymore.
Oh, it's down here? I thought it was up more. I couldn't see. Where is it? Where is John mentioned?
It's on that.
Oh, right here. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so John Philoponus, world eternal, stars and planets move dynamically, and anathema was imposed in 680. That sentence alone, you could write a dissertation on that, because first of all, John Philoponus did not argue that the world is eternal. This is not remotely true. The opposite is true, right? He wrote an entire treatise against Proclus, arguing that the world is, of course, not eternal, because Philoponus was a Christian author, right? Why would he think the world is eternal?
He cites Sorabji. Is this where he got it from? Is this not a good source? Is that what you're saying?
Well, first of all, Sorabji's I think, how is it spelled here? Is it B-I-J?
Sorabij.
Yeah, it should be BJI. So that's
how this? So there's some mistakes in
Yeah.
this book. Oh
Yes,
wow.
and so Richard Sorabji is a well-known historian of philosophy. Of course, he doesn't claim that John Philoponus thought the world is eternal, right? It's the other way around. And then the next step is that something about the planets and stars moving dynamically.
Yeah.
That is a tautology, right? Everything that moves dynamically, because dynamics is the study of the forces that make things move. And the thing with Philoponus is he had a different theory of dynamics than Aristotle. And of course, he applied to the stars and planets, but that's neither here nor there. And then we read about this anathema. Yeah, that anathema is also mentioned in Sorabji's book, but it has nothing to do with philosophy. He got anathemized after his death because he had the wrong ideas about the Trinity, right? That sort of thing happens a lot in the history of Christianity.
Mhm.
You have the wrong idea about the Trinity or something like that, and eventually some council says, okay, this guy is no longer canonical. Or even his works need to be burned or something like that. These things happen with theology, and so it's very misleading to add this anathema information about the anathema in a sentence on his philosophical views, because there's no connection there. But that plays a role later on.
De Gruyter, what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, again, whoever peer reviews a book like that might be an expert on one aspect of it, but if it's so wide-ranging, they're probably going to be out of the depth very soon, or maybe even skip certain passages because they think this is not my problem. But what's going on here?
Usually in a case like this, the peer reviewers they just didn't have the right peer reviewer for this section right here.
Oh yeah, I mean this happens all the time, this sort of thing. The Hypatia argument is really interesting, right? There's, of course, a film by Alejandro Amenábar called Agora, which came out in 2009, which uses the idea that Hypatia was a heliocentrist as a plot device. But as far as I know, this is the first time in history that anybody claimed that. But in this book, what he makes a couple of strange remarks. I mean, I don't see the page right now, but I think I can remember what he says very broadly, right? He writes about Hypatia's astronomical research, which already is a big if, because we don't have any evidence that she did any astronomical research, right?
Yeah, isn't it true we don't have anything from her at all?
It's partially true. So her actual writings, as in the commentaries that she wrote, right? All that's mentioned in Byzantine sources or late antique sources is that she commented on mathematicians like Diophantus and Apollonius. Those are gone to my knowledge, but she was also an editor of texts, just like her father. I mentioned this early in our conversation, how these people invested a lot of time and effort into preserving ancient mathematics, creating new editions, more correct editions, and writing commentaries. And she did that a lot. And maybe so it's very likely, for instance, that the version of Ptolemy's Almagest that we have now in Greek goes back to an edition that she and her father worked on, and she's in fact potentially credited with doing a whole edition of Ptolemy. That doesn't mean that she
was scientifically minded then, and that's
absolutely but the evidence we have doesn't tell us anything about original ideas that either Theon or Hypatia had. These are preservers and commentators, very important ones.
Yeah.
Her student Synesius at one point talks about her sending him instructions for making an astrolabe or something along those lines, right? She knew how an astrolabe is made. That doesn't mean that astrolabes were part of her astronomical research, because an astrolabe is not a research tool, really. It's a computational device, and the main purpose in that period would have been to cast a horoscope using an astrolabe as computational support. There's a sort of sighting tool on the back that you might be able to use for altitude measurements, but very crude ones. So just because she knew what an astrolabe is, her father wrote a whole treatise on the astrolabe, doesn't mean there was any research going on. But the point I wanted to really raise here is this whole idea that Ptolemy has something to do with a secret heliocentric agenda. I mean, the argument overall is not very logically cogent, but well, yeah, Ptolemy famously interpreted the Earth as the center of the solar system, as it said here. I mean, to be very clear, Ptolemy didn't invent that idea, right? It's just a default assumption across sort of human history that the Earth stands still. And it's also not true that it was the standard book on astronomy throughout the Middle Ages, maybe in the Greek East, not in the Latin West. But there's a whole sentence here about the spectacular case of plagiarism, Ptolemy borrowing earlier computations based on the heliocentric system and then claiming them as his own or basing his own computations on them. I don't know how that's supposed to work technically, right? I don't know what a computation based on the heliocentric system is and how that would fit into the Almagest. But this is not true.
He cites this Newton character down here. Exactly. As you check into that. Yeah.
So he says research in the early 19th and again 20th century. I mean, I know all of these books, right? Because it's a bit of my wheelhouse.
That's old. That's not up to date. That's old.
Yeah. So Delambre, 1819, is a history of medieval philosophy from the early 19th century, and Delambre makes a very common argument that's just generally accepted that some of Ptolemy's astronomical observations are not very reliable, and that's because he essentially sometimes fits them or sort of manipulates his results to make them fit his theories. Data fudging is a common phenomenon in Ptolemy's Almagest, and we've known about this for 200 or more years, but this has nothing to do with this heliocentric plagiarism case. Newton is a different beast. So Newton's 1977 book is called The Crime of Claudius Ptolemy, and it's like a 400-page Philippic against Ptolemy, saying Ptolemy is the worst scientific fraud in history, basically accusing him of getting his best stuff from Hipparchus. Hipparchus is the 2nd century BC astronomer, and he's often been accused of taking his star catalog from Hipparchus and only making a few adjustments, but not admitting that it's just a rehash of this very old star catalog. There's a degree to which Ptolemy is now exonerated because we have potentially some remnants of Hipparchus' star catalog, and it's not the same thing. So maybe he's off the hook now. But the point is that Newton really maximalized this idea that he's constantly just lying when he says he made this observation on this date and it has that kind of value, that he's sort of making up data to fit his theories, and is basically a very dishonest author. It has nothing to do with heliocentrism. That's not an argument that Newton ever made in this book, as far as I can tell. So I have no idea why this is mentioned on this page as something that has been shown by earlier scholars. It's completely made up, as far as I can tell. And to be clear, historians of astronomy since Newton have been pretty unanimous in saying Newton went too far. Some people are actually have circled the wagon around Ptolemy and said Ptolemy is great. Stop, being so mean about Ptolemy. But overall, the idea we have is that Ptolemy did a little bit of data fudging, like other people in this period did as well. But it's anachronistic to call him like a heinous fraud of a scientist.
And by the way, the geocentric model is not that unscientific based on what we can observe. It's deductive reasoning. You're just looking at how the stars move for the way we see it is they look like they're all coming around us,
Yes. The thing is, the reason Ptolemy became such a big deal in the history of astronomy is because he was able to produce the most powerful models in terms of their predictive capability. They also had some explanatory power, but the reason his Almagest prevailed is nobody had come up with more useful models when it comes to the actual practical cash out of astronomy, which is to cast a horoscope and have seemingly reliable data about where the planets are at any given point in time. Heliocentrists, which existed in early antiquity, like in the 3rd, 2nd century, Aristarchus, I think, is from the 3rd century BC. We don't know enough about heliocentrists, but it seems that they never produced these kind of predictively viable models, right? And
but
so
did Aristarchus actually make? Is it true that he did propose heliocentrism?
It seems so. I mean, we don't have first-hand evidence from Hipparchus.
What a genius!
Yeah, it's really interesting. This has been like one of these popular big questions in the history of astronomy. Why exactly did Aristarchus proposed this back in the 3rd century BC, when Greek astronomy was still, to an extent, in its infancy, right? It's a very early period. We have some writings by Aristarchus, but not the one where this is being proposed, but later authors tell us, right, he said, the Earth goes around the sun. Our knowledge of Aristarchus is so limited that we can't even be sure that he had a fully worked out heliocentric theory like we know from Copernicus, right, where all the other planets go around the sun as well. It's likely, but we don't really know. And sort of the paper trail of Greek heliocentrism kind of disappears a while before Ptolemy, as far as I can tell. Ptolemy still feels the need to make some philosophical arguments why the Earth is obviously resting in the center. But not because he was sort of trying to argue against competitors who were heliocentrists in his own day. And his stuff is scientific in the sense that nobody that we know had a more systematic and successful way of using observational data and cashing them out in terms of a kinematic model than you can actually extract numerical tables from that help you to compute where a planet is going to be at any given point in time. It's a mathematical masterpiece, many people would say.
Yeah. Do you think that it's possible that the geocentric model was sort of more preferred because the Bible sort of makes the geocentric model its core thing?
For Christians, undoubtedly. I mean, but by the time Christians had any say in this, heliocentrism, as far as I can tell, was no longer on the market. The other main reason is, of course, if you look at what kind of philosophy was popular in the Roman imperial period and beyond, it was Aristotle and Plato. Those were very obviously committed geocentrists, right? So, there's a natural kind of synergy between Ptolemaic astronomy, Aristotelian cosmology, Christianity. If there's one thing they can all agree on, is that the Earth stands still. Christianity is often accused of also in sort of reintroducing a kind of flat Earth cosmology. That's only true to a very limited extent. So you get developments in the east, sort of in the Levant, right, and sort of the Syria, Palestine area, which of course is also to an extent Greek speaking, where you get a whole sort of tradition of Greek authors, starting, I guess, in the late 4th, 5th centuries, who support biblical cosmology, which is sort of a out-and-out attempt to extract a model of the world that's not influenced by Greek thought, and that's where your cosmos starts to look like a square or a tabernacle, and the Earth is flat, and then that continues for a while. We don't have much evidence of that happening in the Latin West or elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world, and overall, Christianity can be credited for introducing the spherical Earth model to places where it never played a role, right, amongst the ancient Germans and Celts and so on, right? I mean, for all we know, their cosmologies were flat Earth cosmologies, before they got Christianized in that part of the world. But yeah, I mean, geocentrism and Christianity.
But they still got it from the Greeks, though, the pagan Greeks.
Ultimately, exactly. Yeah. So that the point is that, of course, the Latin Church or Latin churches in the West, they preserve a kind of Greek cosmology in the kind of writings they read and copy, and that gets passed on, and that's the explanation why medieval Latin Europe, for all its flaws, is not a flat Earth civilization.
Yeah, and as for how much we criticize the Christianity for being superstitious, they saw themselves as the not so superstitious of the bunch of the other. They saw the other pagan religions as superstitious. They saw themselves as more rational. So, like Thomism, for example, is trying to include Aristotelian thinking. They're trying to be scientific as much as possible, but not just having. They obviously have their dogmas in place that the Bible says this, so we're going to follow this. But outside of that, you can see them trying to be very rational. They don't believe in superstitions and that type of thing. Even though today there's this, like, I saw the Pope every year in January comes out and does this like omen thing where I don't know if you know the Saint January blood thing, where there's a container of blood, and they come out every year in January and say, if the blood is liquid, that's a good omen. We're gonna have a good year. If it's thick and hard, we're gonna have a bad year. So, like, there is examples of sort of the same superstitious sort of omen thing going on, but I would say ultimately Christians did try to, carry themselves in a more, I don't know, less superstitious than other people. That's how they saw themselves, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common self-perception that I think really kicks into high gear in the 11th century or towards the end of the 11th century, when, there's this beginning of a fad in Christian Latin philosophy of always trying to deduce everything from reason and viewing, like, it's of the implementation of Aristotelian logic and its burgeoning application to theology, and especially the Jews are often the target in the 12th century of these kinds of accusations of being irrational about religious matters and not being as endowed with the light of reason as Christians are. You get less of these kinds of polemics in the early Middle Ages, but there's so many different registers of rationality. What I find important sometimes to, for instance, bear in mind that Augustine is somebody who often writes about superstition a lot and how certain practices are superstitious. But part and parcel of the way he approaches this is to say certain things cannot happen naturally, right? Astrology is nonsense, and certain magical practices are nonsense because that's just not how nature works. But he still accepts that some people can pull these things off. And why? Because they're in cahoots with demons, right?
Demons.
That's sort of the flip side of his kind of rationality. Yeah, the world doesn't work like that, but the demons can make it seem like it works like that because they are manipulating nature behind the scenes because they can move very fast and are very knowledgeable and the things of that nature. So there's a demonology that kind of accounts for like paranormal phenomena, while at the same time somebody like Augustine has a very otherwise very sort of hard-nosed naturalistic view of how nature works.
Yeah. I had a little note on astrolabes, and that's these, there's this idea that where did the idea that Hypatia invented it? And we know that's not true now. Where did that come from?
I guess it's just because of this cult of Hypatia. I mean, Hypatia is a female philosopher who was famous in her own day, and because of the fact that she was killed by a mob of Christians, apparently affiliated with the Bishop of Alexandria, she's become the stuff of many legends, right? Because there are modern movements like feminism and various forms of secularism who appreciate her function as a figurehead of some sort. But yeah, that was never based on anything. So Synesius, her former pupil, talks about her knowing how an astrolabe is built. I can't reproduce the precise passage, but that's it. But she can't be the inventor of the astrolabe because her father, decades earlier, had written a treatise on the astrolabe, and we know that the principles of the astrolabe were known in the BC era, right? Vitruvius talks about, I think it's Vitruvius, talks about an anaphoric clock, which is a kind of device in the Tower of Winds in Athens, which already uses the principles of stereographic projection to work similar to an astrolabe. Hipparchus probably already knew a lot of this kind of underlying mathematics. So the astrolabe goes back way further in Greek history, even though before Theon we don't have like clear evidence of the
plus we know that the Antikythera mechanism has all like the same sort of dynamics or mechanics going on with an astrolabe, right?
Well, the Antikythera mechanism is more like a simulation of planetary motion. It's more like a computational device in a different way. So they simulate different things. So an astrolabe essentially simulates the revolution of the celestial sphere relative to an observer. So the way, the whole firmament with all its stars revolves around you in 24 hours, that's the kind of thing the astrolabe makes computable using a principle called stereographic projection, which possibly was already known in the 2nd century BC. I think that's the general consensus. The Antikythera mechanism,
way before Hypatia. Way
before Hypatia. And the Antikythera mechanism, which also probably dates from the 2nd century BC as far as the design is concerned, models something else, namely where the planets are going to be in the zodiac, plus when eclipses are going to appear, plus some calendrical stuff. I'm really condensing it here, but they have different functions. And of course, the thing about the Antikythera mechanism is you turn a knob and things move almost magically. The astrolabe is a much simpler affair. You just turn a dial around.
Last thing I want to ask you about is, because I've been talking to Candida Moss, Christian scholar, who's pointed out to me that a lot of these so-called like persecutions of the Christians was not as bad as it's recorded. Like the idea that Christians were being fed to lions is mostly not true. There was some bad periods. Diocletian was a pretty rough patch. Diocletian did, in fact, issue edicts that were pretty rough for Christians. But then before that, you had like one bad year under Decius. You have a few rough spots, and then the rest, and then it goes all the way into the 1st century, and Nero and Domitian, and we don't even know if that's Christians. We don't know if they're still Jews at that point, and we're just including Jewish history into Christian history. Who knows? The point that she was making is the idea that Christians were illegal and persecuted and being fed to lions for 300 years, and then magically like came out of it and became, like overcame it, like is nonsensical. But I want to ask you is to flip the idea that the tables turn, and the Christians get power, and they start. You have these stories about the Serapis Temple being destroyed and Hypatia being murdered. And what are your thoughts on that? What's the truth about the Christians turning the tables and persecuting pagans?
Overall, this is a bit outside of my wheelhouse. So the Candida Moss sort of theory is something that I thought is pretty much consensus amongst modern day historians who deal with that chapter in the history of Christianity, that of course there are sort of episodic severe persecutions, but it's all a bit dramatized or over dramatized in hagiographic literature, and these martyr stories that are sometimes only written down centuries after the fact, and so on. It's I think necessarily a very mixed picture, and you can find evidence either way, right? You can find evidence archaeologically of temples being quite clearly razed to the ground, potentially in ways like as happened with the Serapeon in 391 or so. I think there's more evidence overall of temples just either slowly falling into disuse or even being preserved or being converted into churches. The archaeological record doesn't point towards like large scale Taliban style massive destruction of idols or something, at least as far as I can tell from the little reading I've done. Alexandria is always going to be a difficult case because it kind of has this reputation of being the most violent city in the ancient world, right? Where things probably go to a head more frequently than elsewhere. I mean, pagans sort of are able to live as holdouts, especially amongst sort of the more aristocratic layers of society for a pretty long time, well into the 5th century.
Yeah, even beyond that.
And even beyond that, right? The
Council of Trullo mentions it.
The late Platonists do their thing well into the 6th century, right?
Yeah, this source right here from the Quintus Sex Council, and we're talking late 7th, almost into the 8th century, and they're talking about what to do with pagans. Like one of the things that they're discussing at this council is, well, we found these pagans over here in Asia Minor, and they're following these festivals. What should we do? Not saying they're going to kill them or anything like that, but they're like, it's just one of the things that they're talking about late in the 7th century, which suggests to me that pagans were still around, right?
I suppose so. I mean, that's really far beyond my sort of range of experience. I'm not sure what happened in the 7th century in the Byzantine Empire in this regard, but it seems possible to me. I mean, overall, the record is mixed, but sort of this really, I mean, there's this Catherine Nixie darkening age narrative, where the Christians are essentially the Taliban of late antiquity, and that they're just going around smashing temples and
putting
burning
crosses on
killing people. Yeah, that is, I think, you're not going to find many historians who support that even remotely. There's overall more, idea that things are moving slowly overall, right? And that there is just a lot more peaceful coexistence than maybe is sometimes suggested. And you can sort of see this in the careers of late ancient Roman aristocrats and the degree to which they hold on to at least the pagan lifestyle, and they still are able to be in good standing with the imperial court, even though the imperial court has become nominally Christian at that point, and so on, right? I mean, there's overall just a sign of slow change rather than constant chaos and fighting, although Alexandria is maybe not a good example because that's a violent city.
Yeah, this idea that like there's crosses on pagan, obviously there's some truth to it, but is it over dramatized? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's I'm probably not gonna. I shouldn't comment on that, right? We're really leaving my wheelhouse here, so maybe not. I'd like to know. I probably should do some reading.
I always see the same example, like this one I've seen. That's on the cover of Catherine Nixie's book. I've seen that one before. I've seen this one before. I would love to see more examples of this being some sort of common thing, right? But yeah. Anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem with a lot of this stuff is if we find something and we go, that must be the norm. Like we just could have. There might be a few examples of it. It might have been something that happened with certain groups of people. There might be a certain group of really zealous Christians in one particular place. I mean, I don't know how you measure the normativity of this type of thing.
Absolutely. Well, all you can do is maybe just compare all specimens you have and then just look at the statistics. But sometimes even that can be difficult because, especially with artifacts, a lot of them tend to come from one particular place. And these artifacts were produced more widely, but the other regions or places haven't given you any examples, right? I mentioned the examples of palimpsests earlier, where so many come from one monastery. You wonder how representative that is, and something similar is, I'm sure, also true of certain forms of sculpture and all sorts of other things. So caution is always advised, but I really don't know enough about crosses on statues. I feel I have some homework to do now.
Religion for Breakfast did a video on it. It was pretty good, pretty balanced. I forgot what his conclusion was, but it was pretty good. Something I would worth checking out. You know who that is, right? Religion for Breakfast.
I do know who he is. Yeah. That's a good channel, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. He did a video on it not too long ago. But anyways, I think we've touched on a lot here. Is there any big things we're missing?
Let me see. I'm not sure. I'm not sure there are many things missing. No, I mean the Library of Alexandria is probably the one thing that I had sort of in the back of my mind that people want to know about when it comes to this general topic, because of course there's the story of the library burning down and the Dark Ages happening because all the knowledge gets lost, right? But I think we covered the true history of, or the more likely history of what actually happened to ancient texts enough to make it clear that this library story is a bit overblown, because to be very clear, there are thousands of libraries in the ancient world, right? It's not just one. And
that's what I always tell people. If Alexandria burned, you still have the Library of Antioch, you still have the library in Rome, you still have the library in Pergamum. I think there's a library in Carthage. So do you really think we lost everything? There's only one library? Think about that. Let's just use this is basic IQ now. Come on, let's think about this.
And the other thing about the Library of Alexandria is, I mean, there are different views, but I'm inclined to think it disappeared very early. Like Strabo, who wrote this big book on geography, where he essentially describes different places in the Mediterranean world. He went to Alexandria maybe in 3020 BC, I think. Doesn't mention the library in a passage where he clearly should.
And don't they say it happened during Caesar's time?
So one explanation for that would be, there's this later, very popular story, the most popular story in late antiquity or even the imperial period about the library, is that Caesar is somehow to blame because he intervened in like the Alexandrian Civil War, or ignited it, and then he had a kind of battle against the forces of Ptolemy the 13th in the harbor area, set some ships on fire. The fire got out of control, and then the library burns down. And to many later authors from the 2nd century onwards, that was the explanation, or the 3rd century onwards, that was the explanation why there's no library anymore. But there are questions surrounding the reliability of that report. But what I think is really important to bear in mind, this library, which probably wasn't as big as is claimed in much later sources, was a Ptolemaic project, right? It depended for its upkeep and continuation on the funding from these Ptolemaic pharaonic kings. And in the 2nd century, mid to late 2nd century BC, I think you've got Ptolemy VIII, who is involved in a very bitter power struggle against other members of his family, and his enemies in part are the Greeks in Alexandria. He ends up exiling or murdering significant parts of the Greek population of Alexandria. And we have a papyrus document that tells us the names of the kind of heads of this library with research institute that existed at the Museion, and that list only goes to the reign of Ptolemy VIII, and there is no particularly strong reason to assume that this institution ever recovered from the fact that Greek intellectuals left Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy VIII, and that might be the end of the story as early as the 2nd century BC, as for all we know, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not like this is nothing. It almost has nothing to do with this topic of the Dark Ages, because it's already burned out by then.
Yes, exactly. And once the funding runs out for an institution like that, the clock starts ticking when it comes to the obsolescence of the books, because they have to be replaced every couple of centuries at least for them to remain usable. And lots of other stuff that can be said about this library, right? If it's really true that there were 500,000 books in it, you really have to think very carefully about, was there a building big enough in Alexandria to house all of that shelf space? And how do you actually organize a library that large in terms of finding aids, right, without a modern cataloging system? So, I find it sometimes remarkable how willing even otherwise well-informed authors are in accepting these kinds of figures, because for a pre-modern world, 500,000 scroll library is quite a difficult thing to manage, and also very difficult to maintain in the long run.
My friend Justin Sledge, his channel is called Esoterica, did a video on this where he showed that the remains of the archaeology of the library shows that the building wasn't even big enough to even hold even half of that number, maybe way lower. So it might have been kind of a myth that there was that many books. But they had there's libraries in every major city in the empire. Pergamon had a nice big library too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then of course these are just sort of the really sort of representative, large, state-funded things that we usually think about. But again, as an argument that Netz made in this book I talked about way earlier, that we probably have to think in terms of thousands of libraries when we think about like larger book collections that people have at their homes, or that support schooling and so on. Right? I mean, this is overall a pretty literate society, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I have no more questions. And anything else you want to say?
No, I'm happy we covered so much ground tonight. That was great.
Yes.
I mean, it's night for you. It's afternoon for you.
Yeah, 4:30. So
Right. Yeah.
evening. All right. Well, thank you for your time. I have links in the description for all your stuff and books and everything. And hopefully we'll do this again some other time.
That would be fantastic.
And you have just attained true gnosis.